Why does every civilization that ever drew breath on this planet carry the same nightmare in its bones? Not a vague memory of rain or rising water, but something precise, something technical. Instructions for survival carved into stone, whispered through generations, encoded in myth with the urgency of a warning label. From the mountains of Armenia to the plateaus of Tibet, from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the forests of the Americas, they all speak of the same thing. Not just a flood, the flood. And here's what should stop you cold tonight. They describe it the same way. The measurements match. The warnings echo. The instructions align. As if someone, somewhere, wanted humanity to remember exactly what happened and exactly how to prepare if it ever happened again. But press the like button only if you're the kind of person who lies awake wondering why ancient people who never met built the same ark. Subscribe if you want the history that doesn't fit in textbooks, the kind that hums beneath myth and archaeology. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I want to know who else is out there, piecing this together in the dark. We are taught that flood myths are what primitive people do with natural disasters. A big storm becomes a deluge. A river overflows, and a village drowns, and centuries later, that trauma has grown into a cosmic event. That's how oral tradition works, they say. Exaggeration over time. Cultural memory inflating a local catastrophe into universal myth. And for the most part, that explanation is comforting. Keeps the world small and knowable. Keeps the past safely distant. But it doesn't explain why the myths aren't just similar. They're identical, and they contain details that shouldn't exist. Take the measurements, the dimensions of the vessel. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in cuneiform on clay tablets thousands of years old, Utnapishtim is told to build a cube-shaped ark. 7 decks, each side equal. Specific materials. Pitch inside and out, wood from particular trees. The instructions are obsessively detailed, as if someone needed to ensure nothing was forgotten. Now travel east, to the Hindu Puranas. There, Manu is warned of the flood and told to build a ship. The dimensions are given. The warnings are clear. The salvation is specific. Chosen animals, seeds, the righteous preserved. Now cross the ocean to the Aztec codices. Coxcoxtli is warned by the gods. He builds a vessel. He seals it with pitch. He takes his wife and pairs of animals. The world is destroyed by water. Only those inside survive. You see the pattern. But here's the part that should unsettle you. These aren't poetic similarities. They are engineering instructions. Pitch inside and out. Multiple decks. Specific cubits or measurements translated across languages and eras. Animals in pairs. Seeds preserved. Instructions so precise that if you followed them, you'd end up with a survivable floating structure. This isn't how myth behaves. Myth drifts. Details blur. But these don't. These flood accounts read like technical manuals, copied and recopied, translated but not transformed. As if the original source was something humanity was desperate not to forget. Now consider the timeline. The end of the last ice age. Around 12,000 years ago, the planet convulsed. Ice sheets 2 miles thick collapsed. Meltwater lakes the size of inland seas burst through their barriers. Sea levels rose not in centuries, but in years, sometimes in days. Coastlines vanished. Islands drowned. River valleys became oceans. This is not speculation. The geology confirms it. Core samples from the ocean floor show sudden massive sediment deposits. Submerged forests off coastlines. Cities now underwater, mapped with sonar. Their streets and walls still visible beneath the waves. Dvarka off India. Yanaguni off Japan. The drowned landscapes of Doggerland between Britain and Europe. The evidence is physical, measurable, undeniable. A global catastrophe occurred. Water reshaped the world. But catastrophe doesn't explain the instructions. Natural disasters don't come with warnings encoded in myth. Earthquakes don't whisper build like this next time. Volcanoes don't hand out blueprints. Yet the flood myths do. They warn. They instruct. They specify. As if someone who knew what was coming wanted certain knowledge to survive. And that raises a question we don't ask often enough. What if the flood myths aren't exaggerations of natural events? What if they're records of something planned? Consider what a reset requires. You need to erase the surface but preserve the blueprint. You need to wipe the board clean while ensuring the game can start again. If you were an intelligence, vast and patient, watching a planetary experiment go wrong, how would you correct it? You couldn't simply destroy. That wastes the investment. But you could purge. You could return the surface to zero and let the survivors rebuild from scratch, carrying forward only the knowledge you wanted them to keep. And to ensure that knowledge survived, you'd encode it. You'd make it unforgettable. You'd turn it into myth, into ritual, into the oldest stories every culture tells its children. The flood myths don't just describe water. They describe selection. Utnapishtim is chosen. Manu is chosen. Noah is chosen. Coxcoxley is chosen. Not random survivors. Not lucky ones. Chosen. Warned in advance. Given time to prepare. Given exact instructions. This isn't the language of natural disaster. This is the language of controlled demolition, a quarantine, of reset. And the myths tell us what came after. The world is remade. The survivors step out onto mud and ruin. They are commanded to repopulate, to rebuild. But they are also given gifts. Civilization doesn't slowly crawl back. It appears. Suddenly. Sumer rises from the floodplain with writing, mathematics, agriculture, law, astronomy, all at once. Egypt organizes itself seemingly overnight. The Indus Valley cities are planned from their foundations. As if the survivors didn't start from scratch. As if they remembered. Let's go deeper into the technical details, because that's where the conventional explanations begin to fracture. When you place the flood myths side by side, not as stories but as datasets, patterns emerge that shouldn't be there. We're told these are independent traditions, born from isolated human communities processing their own localized traumas. But isolated communities don't produce identical engineering specifications. They don't encode the same survival protocols. They don't warn about the same celestial signs. In the Mesopotamian account, Utnapishtim is told by Ea to watch for signs in the sky. The gods will send warnings. The text is specific. Darkness at noon, stars visible during the day, the sun and moon appearing together. These aren't poetic flourishes. They're astronomical observations. Atmospheric phenomena. The kind of thing you'd see if massive volumes of water vapor were suddenly released into the atmosphere, bending light, scattering it, creating illusions in the sky. Now go to the Popol Vuh, the Maya creation text. Before the flood, the sky changes. The sun doesn't behave correctly. Darkness falls when it shouldn't. The same signs. Across an ocean. Across millennia. Or consider the ark itself. Not the symbol, the structure. Genesis gives us precise dimensions. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. That's roughly 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet. Multiple decks. A roof. A single door. Sealed with pitch. Now ancient cubits vary, but the ratios don't. And those ratios produce something remarkable. A vessel with a length-to-width ratio of 6:1. Naval architects will tell you that's nearly optimal for stability in rough seas. Too narrow and it capsizes. Too wide and it can't handle waves. 6:1 is the engineering sweet spot for an unpowered floating vessel meant to survive catastrophic water conditions. Whoever wrote those dimensions understood hydrostatics. And it's not just Noah. The Sumerian king list mentions a flood. Before it, kings reigned for impossibly long periods. After it, everything changes. But the instructions for the ark, preserved in the Atrahasis epic and the earlier Eridu Genesis, match. Same materials. Same sealing technique. Same imperative. Preserve life, preserve seeds, preserve knowledge. In India, the Matsya Purana describes Manu's boat with similar care. Large enough for the 7 sages, the seeds of all plants, pairs of all animals. Secured and sealed. The water rises until only the highest peak remains visible. One mountain. One survivor. One chance to start again. The Greek version, the story of Deucalion, follows the pattern. Zeus, angered by human corruption, decides to cleanse the world. Prometheus warns his son Deucalion. Build a chest. Seal it. Stock it with provisions. For 9 days and nights the rain falls. The world drowns. Only Deucalion and his wife survive, landing on Mount Parnassus. When they emerge, they are told to throw stones over their shoulders. The stones become people. Humanity is reseeded. Not born naturally, but created again, intentionally, by divine instruction. Now cross the Pacific. The Hopi speak of multiple worlds, each destroyed when humanity becomes corrupt. The third world ended in flood. The faithful were warned. They were told to cut down trees and hollow them into vessels. They sealed themselves inside. When the waters receded, they emerged into the fourth world, the current world. They carried songs with them, songs that contained the knowledge of what was lost. Songs that must never be forgotten. In Hawaii, the story of Nuyu describes a great flood sent by the god Cain to punish humanity. Nuyu is warned. He builds a great canoe. He takes his family, animals, and plants. The flood covers the earth. Only the peaks of the tallest mountains remain. When the waters recede, Nuyu offers a sacrifice. A rainbow appears. Promise. The same rainbow that appears in Genesis. The same covenant. Across the Pacific. Same symbol. Same meaning. The Chinese have their flood myth in the story of Gunyu. The Emperor Gun tries to stop the Great Flood but fails. His son Yu succeeds by dredging channels and guiding the water away, creating the rivers that shape China. But before Yu, the land was covered. The myths speak of a world drowned, only the highest peaks visible. And here's the remarkable part. Chinese archaeology keeps finding evidence of massive ancient floods in the Yellow River Valley around 1900 BCE, perfectly aligned with the legendary dates of Yu's flood. As if the myth was trying to preserve a historical event, the details sharpened by desperate repetition. What you're seeing here isn't cultural diffusion in the way we usually think of it. This isn't one group telling another, who tells another, the story slowly spreading and mutating. Cultural diffusion blurs details. It localizes. It adapts. But these myths don't blur. They sharpen. They converge. It's as if they're all copies of an original text, a master instruction set, distributed globally before the event and preserved afterward by those who survived. And then there's the timing. Geological evidence points to a cluster of catastrophic events at the end of the Younger Dryas period, roughly 11,600 years ago. Sudden, dramatic warming, the collapse of continental ice sheets, megafloods, the Lake Agassiz outburst, where a glacial lake larger than all the current Great Lakes combined suddenly drained into the ocean, raising sea levels globally in a span that might have been days or weeks. The flooding of the Black Sea, a catastrophic inundation that turned a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea almost overnight, drowning settlements along its shores. Evidence from deep-sea cores showing layers of sediment deposited rapidly, globally, at the same time. But natural catastrophe, no matter how devastating, still doesn't explain the instructions. It doesn't explain the warnings. And it doesn't explain what happened after. Because if the flood was simply nature's brutality, we'd expect a long, slow recovery. Archaeological dark ages. Centuries of struggling back from stone tools and firelight. But that's not what we see. We see explosions of civilization. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, right after the flood window, a massive megalithic temple complex requiring organization, planning, knowledge of astronomy, and engineering that shouldn't exist yet. Sumer appearing suddenly around 4000 BCE with writing, law, and urban planning that seems to have no prototype, no gradual development. As if they didn't invent it. As if they remembered it. Now let's talk about what the myths say happened before the flood. Because it's not just that water came. It's why. And in every tradition, the answer is the same: corruption. Humanity had failed. Not just morally, but fundamentally. In Genesis, the wickedness of man was great, and God regretted making them. In the Atrahasis epic, humans had become too noisy, too numerous, disturbing the gods' rest. In the Hindu texts, it was Adharma, the collapse of cosmic order. In Greek myth, the Bronze Age humans were violent and irreverent. The Hopi say the people had forgotten the songs, forgotten the instructions, forgotten their purpose. This is not a story about rain. It's a story about a failed experiment. And experiments that fail get reset. You wipe the data. You clear the variables. You start the protocol again, but this time with controls, with instructions, with chosen carriers who remember the purpose. Think about what that means. If the flood was natural, the myths would focus on survival, on the terror of the water, on the randomness of who lived and died. But they don't. They focus on who was chosen and why. Utnapishtim was wise. Noah was righteous. Manu was devoted. Deucalion was pious. Again and again, the survivors are selected for specific qualities. Not strength, not luck, virtue, obedience, the ability to follow instructions. And afterward, they are tasked with a mission: rebuild, but remember, preserve the knowledge, pass it on. The myths describe something else too. They describe what was lost. Before the flood, there were giants. Nephilim in Genesis, born from the union of divine beings and human women. The Titans in Greece. The Rakshasas in India, beings of immense power and knowledge who walked the earth before the waters came. And the flood swept them away. Why? Because they were the corruption. The experiment had gone wrong not because humans were violent or loud, but because the boundaries had been crossed. Something had been introduced that wasn't supposed to be there, and it had to be removed. And here's where it gets deeply strange. The myths don't just say these beings existed. They say they taught. The Book of Enoch, which didn't make it into the canonical Bible but was widely read in early Jewish and Christian communities, describes the Watchers, divine beings who descended to earth and taught humanity forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, weapons, cosmetics, astrology, sorcery. They gave humans the tools of civilization, but also the tools of destruction. And for this transgression, the flood was sent to cleanse the earth of their influence. The same theme appears in the Sumerian texts. The Apkallu, 7 sages sent by the god Enki before the flood, who taught humanity the arts of civilization. But after the flood, their influence is limited. They're no longer physical. They become advisors, symbols, memories, as if the flood was specifically designed to sever the direct connection between the teachers and the taught, to ensure that humanity would have to rebuild on its own, guided only by the knowledge encoded in myth and symbol. Now ask yourself, why would a natural disaster care about severing knowledge transfer? Why would a flood specifically target the teachers? Unless it wasn't natural. Unless it was designed to do exactly that. To reset the relationship between humanity and whatever had been guiding it. To remove the direct influence and force humanity to stand on its own, or at least to stand with only the instructions, not the instructors. The Quran offers an interesting detail. The flood of Noah is described, but so is the ark. And the text emphasizes that the ark was built under divine supervision, constructed in a way that would make it a sign for all future generations. It wasn't just meant to survive the flood. It was meant to be remembered, to serve as proof, a physical reminder that the flood was real, intentional, and survivable if you followed the instructions. And in Islamic tradition, the remains of the ark are said to rest on Mount Judi, a real mountain in Turkey, where explorers and pilgrims have searched for millennia, looking for the physical evidence of the reset. What if they're right? What if the flood wasn't meant to erase everything, but to erase most things? To preserve a remnant, a seed, a genetic and mimetic bottleneck that would force humanity through a narrow passage, ensuring that only certain traits, certain knowledge, certain bloodlines would continue. This is how you'd restart a program. You don't delete everything. You roll back to the last stable version. You preserve the core code and recompile. And the survivors are always told the same thing: go forth and multiply. Repopulate the earth. But not randomly. With intention. With memory. Noah's descendants are catalogued in Genesis. The 70 nations, each assigned a territory, each carrying a specific lineage. Manu's children become the progenitors of the human race in Hindu tradition. Deucalion stones become the new humans. In every version, the post-flood world is not a chaotic scramble of survivors. It's organized. It's planned. As if the reset included a restart protocol. And here's what chills me. The myths say it could happen again. The rainbow is a promise in Genesis. Never again by water. But that implies other methods remain on the table. The Hopi say we're in the fourth world. The previous three were destroyed. The fourth will end too when humanity forgets again. The Hindu cycles speak of Kali Yuga, the age of decline ending in fire. The Norse Ragnarok. The Christian Revelation. The Zoroastrian final purification by molten metal. Every tradition says the same thing. If the experiment fails again, there will be another reset. But this time we might be the ones who trigger it. We've reached a point where we can see it coming. Climate data, ice cores, sediment layers, genetic drift analyses. We can read the geological record and say yes, it happened before. But more than that, we're developing the technologies that could do it again. Geoengineering, atmospheric modification, ice sheet destabilization. We're flirting with the same mechanisms that caused the last reset, as if we're compelled to replay it, as if the instructions we carry aren't just how to survive a reset, but how to cause one. Let's examine the aftermath more closely, because what emerged from the flood is as strange as the flood itself. You would expect a slow rebuilding. You'd expect scattered tribes, small communities, stone tools, oral traditions struggling to remember what was lost. That's how collapse works. Rome fell, and Europe descended into centuries of fragmentation and decline. Complex societies take time to build. But after the flood, complexity doesn't build. It appears, suddenly, fully formed. Take Sumer. Around 4000 BCE, in the flatlands of southern Mesopotamia, a civilization emerges that already has writing. Not primitive pictograms slowly evolving into language, but cuneiform script capable of recording complex legal contracts, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, poetry, and mythology. They have the wheel. They have bronze. They have city planning, irrigation systems, temples with precise astronomical alignments, and a sexagesimal numerical system that we still use today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. That's not Sumerian innovation. That's Sumerian memory. Their own texts say so. The Sumerian king list begins with kingship descending from heaven. It doesn't say kings arose from among the people. It says kingship came from above, was given, was bestowed. And before the flood, the list records kings who reigned for thousands of years. Impossibly long reigns. Then the flood. Then the kingship is lowered again, and the reigns become shorter, more human. As if something changed. As if the reset altered the conditions, limited the lifespans, constrained the parameters. The Sumerians also speak of the Abzu, the primordial waters beneath the earth, the source of all knowledge, the dwelling place of Enki, the god of wisdom. And Enki is the one who warns Utnapishtim about the flood, the one who provides the instructions for the ark. He's the preserver, the one who ensures the knowledge survives. And after the flood, it's Enki's priests who hold the knowledge, who read the stars, who calculate the calendars, who keep the old records alive in the temples. The flood didn't destroy the knowledge. It centralized it. It placed it in the hands of a priesthood, a controlled lineage, a human institution designed to remember on behalf of everyone else. The same pattern repeats in Egypt. The civilization appears suddenly, around 3100 BCE, with monumental architecture, centralized government, writing, and a cosmology that's already ancient. The pyramids aren't primitive attempts at building. They're precision instruments. The Great Pyramid's base is level to within a fraction of an inch over 13 acres. Its sides align to the cardinal directions with an error of less than 1/10 of a degree. It encodes the dimensions of the Earth. The ratio of its height to its base perimeter is the same as the ratio of a circle's radius to its circumference. It's not a tomb. It's a message, a marker, a demonstration that whoever built it knew exactly what they were doing. And Egyptian texts describe what came before. The Zep Tepi, the first time when the gods walked the earth. A golden age before the flood, before the chaos, before the current order. And the pharaohs claimed to be restoring that order, bringing back the harmony of the first time. Not creating something new, restoring something old. And their priests kept lists, king lists going back tens of thousands of years, including the reigns of gods and demigods before the human kings. Lists dismissed as mythological by modern scholars, but treated as historical records by the Egyptians themselves. In the Indus Valley, the same sudden appearance. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, cities laid out on a grid with standardized bricks, sophisticated drainage systems, public baths, and script we still can't fully decipher. They appear around 2500 BCE, already mature, already organized. No developmental phase, no prototypes, as if the knowledge of urban planning was already there, waiting to be applied. And when they collapse around 1900 BCE, possibly due to drought or shifting rivers or another catastrophic event, they don't leave much behind. The knowledge vanishes again. The cities are abandoned. The script is lost. Another reset within the reset. China tells a similar story. The Xia dynasty, long considered mythological, is now being taken more seriously by archaeologists finding evidence of its existence. And the myths say it was founded by Yu the Great, the one who controlled the flood, who dredged the rivers, who saved the land. And Yu's knowledge of water management was so advanced that his techniques were still used thousands of years later. Where did he learn it? The texts say from divine instruction, from the Emperor of Heaven, from knowledge passed down from before the flood. The Americas offer the most puzzling case. For a long time, we believed the Americas were isolated, populated only by hunter-gatherers crossing the Bering Land Bridge and slowly spreading south. But now we find evidence of much older habitation. Sites like Topper in South Carolina, with artifacts dated to 50,000 years ago. The Cheruti Mastodon site in California, showing possible human activity 130,000 years ago. And then, suddenly, after the flood window, we see Caral in Peru, around 3000 BCE, a complex urban center with monumental architecture, no pottery, no obvious developmental precursors. Or Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, right after the Younger Dryas, a massive megalithic temple complex built by people who supposedly didn't even have agriculture yet. These aren't slow accumulations of knowledge. They're flowerings, explosions, as if groups of survivors, scattered by the flood, carrying fragments of the old knowledge, finally reached a point where they could apply it again. Where the environment stabilized enough, where the populations recovered enough, where the memory was still strong enough to rebuild. And they all encoded the flood into their architecture. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, artificial mountains, places of refuge above the water. The pyramids, aligned to the stars, built to last through any disaster. The temple mounds of the Americas, raised platforms above the floodplain. They were building with the memory of the flood, building to survive the next one. But here's the key. They weren't just building to survive. They were building to remember. These structures are messages, time capsules. The angles encode mathematical constants. The positions encode celestial coordinates. The chambers contain texts, the oldest texts we have, all speaking about the same thing. What came before, what was lost, how to restore it. The Epic of Gilgamesh was found in the ruins of Nineveh, in Ashurbanipal's library, carefully preserved for centuries. Why? Because it contained the flood story, the instructions, the warning. It was too important to lose. Now we need to address the most unsettling implication. If the flood was intentional, if it was a reset, then who reset it? The myths give us answers, but we don't like them. We've spent centuries rationalizing the gods away, turning them into metaphors, into symbols of natural forces, into projections of human psychology. But the myths don't treat them as metaphors. They treat them as agents, beings with will, with knowledge, with power, beings who watched humanity and judged it lacking, beings who decided to wipe the board clean and start again. In Genesis, it's Yahweh grieving his creation, regretting the humans he made, deciding to destroy all flesh. But he makes an exception for Noah. One family, one genetic line, one carrier of righteousness. In the Mesopotamian versions, it's a council of gods. Enlil, angry at humanity's noise and numbers, convinces the assembly to send the flood. But Enki, the trickster, the wise one, the preserver, defies the council and warns Utnapishtim. Two factions, one wanting to destroy, one wanting to preserve, a disagreement, a compromise, a solution, destroy most, save a remnant. In the Mahabharata, it's Vishnu, taking the form of a fish, warning Manu, guiding his ship through the waters. A divine intervention, a conscious choice to preserve. In the Greek version, it's Zeus, king of the gods, making a decision. Humanity is corrupt. They've violated the natural order. They must be cleansed. But Prometheus, always the rebel, always the human sympathizer, ensures his son survives. Again, the pattern. A decision from above, a warning, a chosen survivor, a restart. What if we take these accounts seriously? Not as primitive superstition, but as testimony. What if there were beings advanced beyond our comprehension, who were present during the last ice age, who watched early humans develop, who perhaps even guided that development, and who, at a certain point, decided the experiment was failing, decided that direct intervention had caused corruption, that humanity was developing in ways it shouldn't, that the only solution was a planetary purge and a fresh start with only the most basic instructions encoded in myth. The evidence for such beings is controversial, but it exists. Megalithic structures we can't explain with the tools available at the time. The Baalbek stones in Lebanon, some weighing over 800 tons, moved and placed with precision. Pumapunku in Bolivia with diorite blocks cut and shaped to tolerances that require advanced machinery. The Yanaguni Monument off Japan, underwater structures that appear artificial, dated to before the flood window. These aren't primitive constructions. They're sophisticated, precise, and in many cases, their purpose remains a mystery. And then there's the genetic evidence. Mitochondrial Eve, the most recent common matrilineal ancestor of all living humans, dated to roughly 150,000 years ago. Y-chromosomal Adam, dated to roughly 200,000 years ago. But here's the strange part. Genetic diversity suggests a population bottleneck around 70,000 years ago, possibly linked to the Toba supervolcano eruption. Human population may have dropped to as few as 10,000 individuals. Then another bottleneck, smaller but still significant, around 12,000 years ago. Right at the flood window. As if humanity was repeatedly reduced, pruned, filtered. Some researchers, controversial ones, suggest we carry genetic markers that shouldn't be there. That human chromosome 2, a fusion of two ape chromosomes, shows signs of deliberate manipulation. That the jump from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens is too abrupt, too significant, lacking clear transitional forms. That the Neanderthal DNA we carry, roughly 2 to 4% in non-African populations, might represent not just interbreeding but an older, pre-flood human variant that was mostly eliminated. That we are, genetically, the product of selection, intentional selection, and then consider consciousness itself. Human consciousness is an anomaly. We don't just think. We think about thinking. We're aware that we're aware. We create abstract art, complex language, mathematics, music, ritual. Abilities that emerge suddenly in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago. The Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Suddenly we have cave paintings, carved figurines, burial goods, symbolic artifacts. Not a gradual development, an explosion, as if something was activated, as if a program was initiated. What if the flood was designed to preserve that activation while removing the destabilizing elements? The giants, the Nephilim, the Watchers, whatever they were, represented a corruption of the program, a deviation, and the flood was the delete key. But the core program, the human capacity for consciousness, for language, for symbolic thought, that was preserved in the survivors, the chosen ones. The ones with the right genetics, the right memetics, the right compatibility with the intended outcome. And if that's true, then what we call civilization isn't our invention. It's our inheritance. We're not creating. We're remembering. Unpacking the instructions encoded in our myths, our symbols, our very DNA. Every technological leap we make, from fire to the wheel to writing to computers to artificial intelligence, isn't innovation. It's restoration. We're rebuilding what was here before. And the speed at which we're doing it, the exponential acceleration of technology over the last century, suggests we're approaching something. A threshold, point of completion, or a point of reckoning. Because if the flood was a reset, then the conditions for another reset might be written into the code. If humanity deviates again, if we become too corrupt, too dangerous, too far from the intended parameters, then the program will reset us again. And this time, we have the power to do it ourselves. Climate change, nuclear weapons, biological warfare, artificial intelligence. We've recreated the tools of planetary destruction, as if we're compelled to test the boundaries to see if the reset mechanism is still active. The myths warn us. The rainbow is a promise, but it's also a reminder. The flood can come again. The Hopi say we're in the fourth world, and it too will end. The Maya calendar reset in 2012, marking not an end but a transition into a new cycle. The Hindu Yuga's cycle through creation and destruction. The Norse believed in Ragnarok, the final battle, after which a new world would emerge. The Christian book of Revelation describes a new heaven and a new earth after the old ones are purged by fire and judgment. We are living in the aftermath of the last reset, and we are building toward the next one. Whether we're building to survive it or to trigger it, that remains to be seen. Let's consider the symbolic language embedded in the flood myths, because symbols are how deep knowledge survives the collapse of civilizations. When libraries burn, when cities fall, when languages die, symbols remain. They're carved in stone, woven into textiles, encoded in ritual, passed from parent to child in stories told at night. And the flood myths are thick with symbols, all pointing to the same truth. This has happened before, and it will happen again. Water is the primary symbol, but not just any water. It's the primordial water, the chaos water, the waters that existed before creation. In Genesis, before God creates the world, the Spirit hovers over the face of the deep, the Tiham, the abyss. That water isn't a place. It's a state. It's potential, unformed. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, creation begins when Marduk defeats Tiamat, the dragon of the salt waters, and splits her body to create heaven and earth. The water is what must be divided, controlled, shaped to create order. And the flood is the return of that water, the uncreation, the order collapsing back into chaos. But the flood doesn't end with chaos. It ends with land re-emerging, with the dove bringing back the olive branch, with the ship resting on the mountain, with new order established. The water recedes, but it doesn't disappear. It returns to its boundaries, to the oceans, to the sky, to the underground reservoirs. It remains, a constant reminder that chaos is always present, always pressing against the walls of order, always ready to return if the boundaries fail. The ark is a symbol too, not just a boat, a vessel of preservation, a container, a womb. It's sealed, dark, isolated from the chaos outside. Inside, life waits. Seeds, animals, humans, all held in suspended animation, in potential, waiting for the right moment to reemerge. The ark is a time capsule, a genetic ark, a library of DNA and knowledge, designed to reboot life after the wipe. And the rainbow, the covenant symbol. God promises never again to destroy the earth by flood, and the rainbow is the sign of that promise. But a rainbow is a physical phenomenon. Light refracted through water droplets. It appears after storms, when the sun breaks through the rain. It's a natural occurrence. But it's also a perfect symbol. The union of water and light, chaos and order, destruction and beauty. It's the resolution of the flood. The proof that the storm has passed but the potential for future storms remains. The rainbow doesn't prevent floods. It reminds us that the mechanism is still there, still functional, still watching. And then there's the mountain. The ark always lands on a mountain. Ararat in Genesis, Judy in the Quran, Parnassus in Greek myth, Manu's ship in the Himalayas. The mountain is the axis mundi, the world pillar, the connection between earth and heaven. It's the highest point, the last refuge, the place where the waters cannot reach. But it's also the place where heaven and earth meet, where the gods descend, where the reset is initiated. Mountains are sacred in nearly every tradition because they survived the flood. They stood above the waters. They were the islands of memory. Consider how flood myths encode time. They all include specific durations. 40 days and nights in Genesis. 7 days in some versions of the Sumerian account. The waters prevail for 150 days. The earth dries for months. These aren't random numbers. 40 is a symbolic number throughout the Bible. 40 years in the wilderness, 40 days of temptation, 40 days of Lent. It's a period of trial, of testing, of transformation. 7 is the number of completion of cycles of divine order. These durations aren't meant to be literal measurements of the flood's length. They're encoding something deeper, instructions for a cycle, a rhythm, pattern that repeats. And the animals, why pairs? Why male and female of every kind? The obvious answer is reproduction, preservation of species. But it's also genetic. It's ensuring diversity. 2 isn't enough for a sustainable population in genetic terms. You need more diversity to avoid inbreeding. But symbolically, 2 is the minimum for continuation. It's the pairing principle, the duality, masculine and feminine, yin and yang, binary code, on and off, the foundation of all complexity. The ark carries pairs because pairs can generate. They can unfold into multitudes. They're the seed algorithm. The myths also encode selection criteria. Noah is chosen because he's righteous. But righteous by what standard? The text says he's blameless in his generation, that he walks with God. That's not just moral virtue. That's compatibility, alignment. He follows instructions. He builds exactly as he's told. He doesn't question. He's the perfect agent for carrying forward the program. The same with Utnapishtim, who is granted immortality after the flood, becoming one of the only humans to achieve it. His reward isn't wealth or power. It's continuity. He becomes a living link to the pre-flood world, a witness, a keeper of memory. In some traditions, the survivors are given specific gifts after the flood. In the Atrahasis, Utnapishtim is taught secrets by Enki. In Hindu tradition, Manu is given the Vedas, the sacred knowledge. In Chinese myth, Yu is shown how to control the waters by divine beings. The survivors don't just carry life forward. They carry knowledge, specific knowledge, the kind that lets you rebuild civilization quickly. Agriculture, metallurgy, writing, astronomy is not learned through trial and error. It's taught, bestowed, downloaded. And here's the detail that should make you pause. In almost every tradition, the survivors are instructed to offer sacrifice after the flood. Noah builds an altar. Utnapishtim makes an offering. Deucalion and Pyrrha give thanks to Zeus. Manu performs rituals. Why? The water has receded. The danger is past. Why sacrifice? Because sacrifice is communication. It's a signal. It tells the watchers, the gods, the intelligence that initiated the reset, that the survivors understand the covenant, that they accept the terms, that they will follow the instructions. The sacrifice isn't for the survivors' benefit. It's for the reset initiators. It's confirmation that the program has successfully rebooted. Now we need to examine the construction instructions more carefully, because they're far too specific to be accidental. The myths don't just say build a boat. They give blueprints, and those blueprints are consistent across cultures that supposedly never had contact. That alone should trouble us. When humans independently invent solutions to similar problems, the solutions vary. Different materials, different designs, different methods. But the flood vessel instructions don't vary. They converge. Let's start with materials. Pitch is mentioned repeatedly. Genesis specifies pitch inside and out. The Sumerian texts specify pitch and bitumen. Pitch is a waterproofing agent, a sealant derived from tree resin or petroleum. It's effective, durable, and would have been available in the ancient Middle East. But why is it specified so carefully? Because without proper waterproofing, a wooden vessel will take on water and sink, especially in rough seas. The instruction isn't poetic. It's functional. It's engineering. And it appears in myths from Mesopotamia to the Americas, where pitch from pine trees or natural tar was used to waterproof canoes and vessels. The structure is always compartmentalized. Multiple decks, rooms, chambers. Genesis describes 3 stories. The ark isn't a hollow shell. It's divided, compartmentalized. Structures are stronger. They prevent total flooding if one section is breached. They allow for organization of cargo, separation of animals, distribution of weight. It's a design principle used in modern ships. Bulkheads, watertight compartments, damage control. The Ark is described as having these features thousands of years before modern naval architecture codified them. And the dimensions, as we discussed, produce a stable, seaworthy vessel. But there's more. The ratio of length to width to height in the Genesis Ark is 30 to 5 to 3. This ratio appears again in other flood myths when you convert the measurements. It's not a coincidence. It's a formula. And in the 1990s, a team of South Korean naval engineers tested the Ark's design using computer simulations and wave tank models. They found it could handle waves up to 30 meters high without capsizing. It wouldn't steer, but it would float, stable and upright, through almost any sea condition. Exactly what you'd need for a global flood. The design isn't symbolic. It's practical. The Sumerian instructions include another detail, a roof, a covering that closes over the top, sealed shut. This isn't just to keep rain out. It's to keep the vessel from taking on water from above during violent storms, to prevent swamping. Modern lifeboats use the same principle, enclosed designs that can right themselves even if capsized. The ancient instructions anticipate the problem and solve it. And then there's the door. One door sealed from the outside. In Genesis, God shuts Noah in. The occupants can't open it from inside. Why? Because in catastrophic conditions, panic can cause people to make fatal decisions. Sealing the door from outside ensures the occupants can't compromise the vessel's integrity. It's a safety feature, a hard override. It also ensures that entry and exit are controlled, that the timing of emergence is not left to human decision but to external conditions. The door opens when the waters recede, when it's safe, not before. Some versions include windows, small openings near the top for air and light, not large enough to compromise structural integrity, but enough to prevent suffocation and allow observation. Practical, thought through. These aren't details a storyteller invents for dramatic effect. They're details an engineer includes to ensure survival. Now consider the cargo instructions. Pairs of animals, yes, but also food. Provisions for months. Genesis specifies that Noah is to take food for himself and for the animals enough to last. That's a massive logistical challenge. Different animals require different diets. Storage would need to prevent spoilage. Water would need to be stored or collected. The instructions assume a level of planning and knowledge about animal husbandry, food preservation, and resource management that suggests the survivors weren't primitive. They were skilled. And seeds. Multiple traditions mention seeds. The preservation of plant species. This is genetic arc thinking. You're not just saving animals. You're saving the entire ecosystem. You're preserving agriculture. You're ensuring that when you emerge, you can restart food production immediately. The survivors aren't expected to forage and hunt their way back to stability. They're expected to plant, to cultivate, to rebuild agricultural societies quickly. Some traditions include written records. The Sumerian texts describe tablets placed in the Ark, records of knowledge that must survive. Enki tells Utnapishtim to preserve the beginning, middle, and end of all knowledge, to bury records in the city of Shuruppak before the flood so they can be recovered after. This is deliberate archival. This is knowledge management. This is ensuring that civilization's accumulated learning doesn't have to be rediscovered from scratch. And then there's the timing. The myths don't just say a flood came. They describe warnings, advance notice, time to prepare. In Genesis, Noah has years to build the ark. In the Sumerian versions, Utnapishtim is given specific signs to watch for. When the gods send the rain, when the timing is right, he's to enter the ark and seal it. This isn't a surprise catastrophe. It's a scheduled event. A planned reset with a countdown. What kind of natural disaster comes with advance warning and time to build a large vessel? Earthquakes strike suddenly. Volcanoes can give some warning but not years. Tsunamis give minutes, maybe hours. But a gradual climate shift, a slow destabilization of ice sheets, a predictable collapse point, that could give years of warning. Or, if the event is controlled, if it's triggered intentionally, then of course there would be warning. The chosen survivors would be notified. They'd be given time to prepare. They'd be given instructions. And the instructions would be preserved in myth, not just to remember what happened, but to prepare for the next time. Because here's the deepest implication. The myths don't present the flood as a one-time event. They present it as cyclical. The Hopi explicitly state multiple worlds destroyed by different means. Hindu cosmology describes cycles of creation and dissolution spanning millions of years. The Maya calendar resets. The Norse believed in eternal return. Even Genesis, though it promises never again by water, doesn't promise never again. The mechanism remains. The possibility remains. The instruction set remains, waiting in myth, in symbol, in collective memory, ready to be activated when the next reset becomes necessary. Let's turn our attention to what happened immediately after the floodwaters receded, because this is where the story becomes most strange. If the flood was a natural catastrophe, we'd expect chaos. Scattered survivors, traumatized populations, a long period of recovery. But the myths describe something else. They describe order, rapid reorganization, instructions given and followed, as if the post-flood world was not an accident but a design. In Genesis, Noah's first act after leaving the ark is to build an altar and offer sacrifices. The smell is pleasing to God, who then establishes a covenant. Never again will all life be destroyed by flood. The rainbow appears as a sign, but then God gives instructions. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. And importantly, every living thing is now in your hands. They will fear you. This is a transfer of dominion. Pre-flood, humans lived alongside other creatures. Post-flood, humans are given authority, control, separation. The relationship between humans and nature has fundamentally changed. Why? What shifted? One interpretation: the flood removed something from the ecosystem. The giants, the Nephilim, the beings of immense power. With them gone, humans are now the apex, the dominant force. The reset didn't just cleanse the world of corruption. It removed competition. It cleared the board so humanity could develop without interference from more powerful beings. The post-flood world is a human world, by design. Noah then plants a vineyard. Agriculture resumes immediately. Not foraging, not hunting. Cultivation. Domesticated plants. Knowledge of viticulture. Wine production. Within a generation, civilization is restarting. His sons are assigned territories. Shem, Ham, and Japheth become the progenitors of different peoples, spreading across the earth. The Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10 catalogs 70 nations, each descended from Noah's line. This isn't random dispersal. It's organized colonization. And the number 70 appears again, a number of completeness, of divine order. But then comes the Tower of Babel. Humanity, united in language and purpose, decides to build a tower to reach heaven. And God, seeing this, says something remarkable. Now nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. So God confuses their language and scatters them. Why? If humanity is supposed to rebuild, why sabotage their cooperation? Unless cooperation itself is the problem. Unless the point of the reset was not just to cleanse but to fragment. To prevent humanity from becoming too unified, too powerful, too capable of achieving things that would again upset the balance. The Babel story is often interpreted as a punishment for human pride. But what if it's another control mechanism? A second stage reset. The flood removed the giants and the direct influence of the watchers. Babel removed human unity. After Babel, humans speak different languages, form different cultures, develop in isolation. They can't share knowledge easily. They can't coordinate on a global scale. They're divided, and division keeps them manageable. It keeps them from again reaching the point where nothing they plan is impossible. And yet, despite the division, the same knowledge appears in multiple cultures. Writing in Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica. Monumental architecture, astronomy, mathematics, urban planning. It's as if the knowledge was distributed before Babel, carried by the dispersed peoples, and then developed in parallel. or as if the instructions, the core program, was embedded so deeply that even separated cultures would unpack it in similar ways. The Sumerian king list provides another clue. After the flood, kingship is again lowered from heaven. The post-flood kings have shorter reigns, more human lifespans, but they're still described as receiving their authority from above. They're not warlords who seized power. They're appointed, chosen, and their role is to maintain order, to build temples, to connect heaven and earth. The king is a mediator, a bridge, a representation of the covenant between the gods and humanity. In Egypt, the pharaohs claim the same authority. They're not just rulers. They're gods incarnate. They're Horus, the son of Osiris, the inheritor of divine kingship. And their primary duty is to maintain Ma'at, cosmic order, the balance, to prevent chaos from returning, to keep the waters at bay. The flood isn't just historical in Egyptian thought. It's cosmological. It's the ever-present threat of isfit, chaos, dissolution. And the pharaoh's role is to prevent its return through ritual, through building, through maintaining the structures that hold reality together. Hindu texts describe the Manvantara, the age of Manu. After each flood, a new Manu appears and reestablishes civilization. We're currently in the 7th Manvantara, meaning there have been 6 previous resets, 6 previous floods, 6 previous Manus. Each age lasts millions of years in the cosmic scale, but the principle remains. Periodic destruction, periodic renewal, guided by a chosen survivor who carries forward the seed of civilization. The Greek tradition has a similar structure. After Deucalion's flood, the stones thrown over his shoulder become people, but not just any people. The stones of Deucalion become men. The stones of Pyrrha, his wife, become women. They're literally created, generated from earth and stone, at the command of divine instruction. This is not natural reproduction. It's manufacture, instantiation, and from these created humans, the new generation descends. In all these traditions, the post-flood world is not a return to primitive life. It's a reboot into a new order. And that order includes hierarchies. Kings, priests, scribes, farmers, laborers. Specialization appears quickly. Cities form. Temples are built. The survivors don't live as nomadic hunter-gatherers for thousands of years before slowly developing agriculture and writing. They do it immediately within generations, as if they already knew how, as if the instructions were clear. And they build monuments everywhere. Structures designed to last, to communicate, to mark. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia are artificial mountains, places where heaven and earth connect, just like the mountain where the ark landed. The pyramids of Egypt are aligned to stars, built with precision that rivals modern engineering. Stonehenge, Karnak, Göbekli Tepe, all massive stone structures requiring coordination, knowledge, purpose. They're not just buildings. They're messages. They're markers saying we were here, we survived, we remember, and many of these monuments are aligned to celestial events. Solstices, equinoxes, star risings. They're calendars. They track time. They predict cycles. Why does that matter? Because if the reset was predictable, if it followed a cycle, then tracking time becomes survival. You need to know when the next event might occur. You need to watch the skies, read the signs, be ready. The monuments aren't just religious. They're early warning systems. We need to address the global distribution of these flood accounts and what it implies. We're told that humans dispersed from Africa, gradually spreading across the globe over tens of thousands of years, developing independently, creating unique cultures. But if that's true, why do separated cultures, with no supposed contact, all have the same flood story? The conventional answer is universal human experience with local floods. But local floods don't produce identical survival instructions. They don't encode the same measurements. They don't share the same theological framework of divine judgment and chosen survivors. The alternative explanation is diffusion. One culture developed the story and spread it through trade, migration, and conquest. But diffusion doesn't work either, because the flood myths appear in cultures that were isolated during the relevant time periods. The Americas were supposedly cut off from Eurasia after the Bering Land Bridge flooded at the end of the Ice Age, around 11,000 years ago. Yet Native American flood myths match Mesopotamian ones. The Polynesians, spreading across the Pacific in the first millennium CE, have flood myths that match those of much older cultures. The Australian Aborigines, isolated for 40,000 years or more, have flood stories describing the land being covered, survivors retreating to high ground, the world being remade. The only explanation that fits the data is that the flood myths originate from a shared event, a real global catastrophe, witnessed by ancestral populations before the dispersal, and carried forward into every descendant culture. The memory was so traumatic, so significant, that no culture forgot it. And the instructions were so important that no culture allowed them to be lost. But that raises the question, if it was a shared memory from before global dispersal, why do the myths contain details that shouldn't be there? Why do they describe technologies and knowledge that supposedly didn't exist yet? Why do they speak of writing, metal tools, large ships, when the flood supposedly occurred at the end of the Ice Age before the Neolithic Revolution? Unless the flood didn't occur when we think it did. Or unless the level of human civilization before the flood was far more advanced than we acknowledge. There's growing evidence for the latter. Göbekli Tepe, built around 9,600 BCE, requires organization, labor coordination, symbolic planning, and knowledge of stoneworking that shouldn't exist in a pre-agricultural society. Yet there it is. And it was deliberately buried around 8,000 BCE, covered with soil, hidden. Why? Some researchers propose a cataclysmic event around 10,800 BCE, at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and another around 9,600 BCE at its end. Cosmic impacts, asteroid or comet fragments striking the ice sheets, causing massive meltwater floods. The evidence is debated but intriguing. A widespread carbon-rich layer in sediment cores, nanodiamonds formed by extreme heat and pressure, megafaunal extinctions across North America and Europe, sudden climate shifts recorded in ice cores. If such impacts occurred, they would have caused exactly what the myths describe: rapid, catastrophic flooding. The ice sheets would have melted suddenly. Ocean levels would have risen. Coastal regions would have drowned. Survivors would have retreated to high ground, to mountains, to whatever vessels they could construct. And if there were advanced human societies at that time, coastal societies, they would have been obliterated. Their cities, now hundreds of feet underwater, lost to the ocean. Only the survivors, carrying fragments of knowledge, would remain to rebuild inland. And that's exactly what we see. Underwater archaeology is finding more and more evidence of submerged settlements. Dvarka off India's coast, described in Hindu texts as a great city that was swallowed by the sea. Yonaguni off Japan, terrace structures that appear to be carved and arranged, not natural formations. The Persian Gulf, which was dry land during the Ice Age, a fertile valley with rivers, now submerged. Could that be the location of Eden? The original garden, drowned when the Gulf flooded? The myths say Eden was to the east, near rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates once flowed further south, into the Gulf Basin before the sea rose. This reframes everything. The flood didn't destroy primitive hunter-gatherers. It destroyed civilizations, advanced ones that built in stone, that knew astronomy, that organized labor, that created art and writing. And the survivors, forced to rebuild, carried what they could remember. The knowledge degraded over generations. Writing was lost and rediscovered. Techniques were forgotten and relearned. But the core myths, the flood stories, those were kept pristine. Because they were warnings. Because they contained survival instructions. Because remembering the flood was the most important knowledge of all. And if that's true, then we're not the first advanced civilization on Earth. We're the latest. We're the inheritors, the post-reset phase. And every time we excavate deeper, every time we push the dates back, we find evidence that supports this. Derinkuyu, the underground city in Turkey, carved from solid rock, capable of housing 20,000 people, with ventilation shafts, water systems, defensive mechanisms. Built when? We don't know. Why? To survive something catastrophic. To go underground when the surface became uninhabitable. Or the Rikhat structure in Mauritania, the Eye of the Sahara. A massive circular formation, concentric rings, roughly 40 kilometers across. Geologists say it's a natural dome, eroded over millennia. But some researchers note its resemblance to Plato's description of Atlantis. Circular city, concentric rings of water and land. Could it be the remnant of a pre-flood city, now in the middle of the desert because the climate shifted, because the water dried up after the Ice Age ended? Atlantis itself is dismissed as myth, but Plato claimed it was real, that the story came from Egyptian priests who kept records going back thousands of years. He described it as an advanced civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time, which places it right at the Younger Dryas boundary. He said it was destroyed in a day and a night by earthquake and flood, sinking into the ocean. If you map that onto the end of the Ice Age, onto the rapid sea level rise, onto the catastrophic flooding events, suddenly Atlantis isn't fantasy. It's memory. And if one advanced pre-flood civilization existed, why not more? Why not a global network of societies, trading, communicating, building? And when the flood came, when the ice melted and the seas rose and the impacts struck, most were wiped out. Only scattered survivors remained, carrying fragments, building monuments to encode what they remembered, preserving the knowledge in myth and symbol so that future generations would know. This happened before, and it will happen again. Now we arrive at the most troubling possibility. If the flood was intentional, a reset device triggered by an intelligence beyond our understanding, then that intelligence is still here, still watching, still assessing whether humanity is developing according to plan or deviating again. And if we're deviating, if we're approaching the same corruption that necessitated the last reset, then the mechanism could be triggered again. The myths tell us the signs. Before the flood, humanity was corrupt. In Genesis, the sons of God mated with the daughters of men, producing Nephilim giants, beings of renown. This interbreeding was a violation, a crossing of boundaries that weren't meant to be crossed. And it resulted in violence. The earth was filled with violence, with corruption, with wickedness. That's why the flood came, not as punishment for sin in the moral sense, but as correction for deviation from the plan. What does that mean for us? We're now capable of genetic manipulation. We're editing embryos. We're creating chimeras, hybrid organisms, mixing human cells with animal cells. We're pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human. We're developing artificial intelligence, creating non-biological intelligence that may soon exceed our own. We're modifying our own biology with cybernetics, merging with machines. Are we repeating the violation? Are we again crossing the boundaries that shouldn't be crossed? The myths also describe pre-flood humanity as too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive. The gods couldn't rest. The earth was overwhelmed. And now we're 8 billion people. We've altered every ecosystem. We've driven species to extinction at rates comparable to the great mass extinction events. We've changed the atmosphere, the oceans, the climate itself. We've become a geological force. The Anthropocene, they call it. The age of humans. Are we again disrupting the balance? And we've rediscovered the technologies that could trigger a global reset. Nuclear weapons, biological weapons, geoengineering. We have the power to destabilize the climate, to melt the ice caps, to flood the coasts. We have the power to trigger the very mechanism the last reset used. Are we testing it? Are we compelled by something encoded in our nature to recreate the conditions that necessitate another purge? There's a theory in evolutionary biology called evoked culture, the idea that human behaviors and cultural practices are shaped by deep evolutionary pressures, that we're compelled to repeat certain patterns because they're written into our genes. What if the reset cycle is one of those patterns? What if humanity is programmed to rise, advance, overstep, and be reset again and again, and the flood myths are our species' way of remembering the pattern? Consider the parallels. The pre-flood world had knowledge, power, longevity. The antediluvian patriarchs in Genesis lived for hundreds of years. Methuselah, 969 years. Noah, 950 years. After the flood, lifespans drop rapidly. By Abraham, it's 175 years. By Moses, 120 years. By David, 70 years. The trajectory is clear. Humanity is degrading, decaying, losing something. Or perhaps the reset altered the conditions, changed the environment, shorten the available time. Why? To limit how far each iteration could go before resetting. But now we're extending lifespan again. Medical technology, genetic therapy, life extension research. We're trying to reverse aging, to defeat death. We're reaching back toward the pre-flood state. We're restoring what was lost. Is that the goal? Or is it the warning sign? The ancient texts describe the Watchers as giving humanity forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught men to make weapons and women to wear cosmetics. Shemhazai taught enchantments. Barakel taught astrology. Knowledge that empowered but also corrupted. And now we're gaining knowledge at an exponential rate. Artificial intelligence is accelerating discovery. We're solving problems in years that would have taken centuries. We're decoding the human genome, the language of life itself. We're reading cuneiform tablets with machine learning, recovering lost texts, accessing ancient knowledge faster than ever before. We're remembering, rapidly. And as we remember, as we restore, the same patterns emerge. Inequality, violence, existential threats. We have more knowledge and power than any generation in recorded history, and we're using it to create weapons, to manipulate genetics, to alter consciousness, to build machines that might replace us. The same trajectory, the same corruption. The flood myths warn that there are limits, that there are boundaries, that when humanity exceeds those boundaries, correction comes. Not from within, but from outside. From the intelligence that set the experiment in motion. And if that intelligence is real, if it's watching, then it's assessing us now. It's measuring our deviation. It's determining whether we're salvageable or whether another reset is required. Some traditions speak of a final flood, a last judgment, after which there will be no more chances. Revelation describes a new heaven and a new earth after the old are destroyed by fire. The Hindu Kali Yuga ends in flame and chaos, followed by a new golden age. The Hopis say the fourth world will end, and the faithful will be led to the fifth. Always the same structure: destruction, selection, renewal. But each cycle, fewer survive. Each reset, the conditions tighten. As if the experiment is narrowing, honing, searching for a specific outcome. What is the outcome? What is humanity supposed to become? The myths suggest we're meant to reconnect with the divine, to restore the relationship that existed before the fall, before the flood, before the separation. We're meant to remember our origin, our purpose, our place in the cosmic order. We're meant to transcend the limitations of flesh, to become something more. But not through technology, not through our own power, through alignment, through obedience, through accepting the instructions. And if we refuse, if we insist on doing it our own way, then the reset comes. The waters rise, the chosen are warned, the ark is built, the rest perish, and the cycle begins again. Unless this time we break the cycle. Unless this time we remember in time to change course. Unless the flood myths aren't just records of the past but instructions for the future. Unless the reason they were preserved with such obsessive care is because we're meant to read them now, in this moment, at this threshold, and choose differently. Let's examine the architectural legacy of the flood, because what survivors built in its aftermath speaks volumes about what they were trying to preserve. Every ancient wonder, every monument that still puzzles us, can be seen as a response to the flood. They're not just religious structures or royal vanity projects. They're insurance policies against forgetting. They're physical backups of the instructions, encoded in stone, designed to outlast any future catastrophe. The pyramids of Egypt are the most obvious example. We're told they're tombs, but the evidence is thin. No mummy in the Great Pyramid. No burial inscriptions inside it. No treasure. Just empty chambers and narrow shafts pointing to specific stars. The Orion correlation theory suggests the three Giza pyramids map the belt of Orion as it appeared around 10,500 BCE. That date again. Right at the flood window. And if you accept the astronomical dating, the Sphinx is even older, its erosion patterns suggesting water weathering, rainfall, which means it was carved when the Sahara was wet, before it became desert. Before the climate shift. Before or during the flood period. What if the pyramids weren't built by the Egyptians we know? What if they were inherited, restored, repurposed by the dynastic Egyptians? The texts themselves suggest this. The inventory stela, found near the Sphinx, describes Khufu discovering the Sphinx already buried in sand and ordering it excavated. Not building it, discovering it. The pyramids might be pre-flood structures, built by the advanced civilization that was wiped out, and the Egyptians simply maintained them, built smaller pyramids nearby in imitation, tried to continue the tradition without fully understanding the original purpose. And what was that purpose? The Great Pyramid encodes mathematical constants. Pi in the ratio of height to base perimeter. Phi, the golden ratio in its internal dimensions. The speed of light in the coordinates of its location. The mean radius of the Earth in its height. These aren't coincidences. They're intentional. The pyramid is a data structure, a three-dimensional equation, a message saying we knew, we measured, we encoded it so you would know that we knew. The same encoding appears in other structures. Stonehenge aligns to solstices. The Karnak stones in France are arranged in patterns that track lunar cycles. The Serpent Mound in Ohio is oriented to solar and lunar events. These aren't primitive attempts at calendars. They're sophisticated astronomical computers, marking time, tracking cycles, predicting events. Why? Because time is the key. If the reset follows a cycle, if it's predictable, then tracking time becomes survival. You need to know when the window opens, when the danger returns. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia are explicitly described as connecting heaven and earth, as being built on the spot where the gods descended. The Sumerians believed the gods lived atop the ziggurats, that the priests would ascend to meet them. But architecturally, ziggurats are also elevated platforms, artificial mountains, places of refuge. If another flood came, the ziggurat would be the last place standing. They're literal high ground, temples and arcs combined. And then there are the underground structures, Derinkuyu, Kemakli, and other subterranean cities in Cappadocia, Turkey. Massive, multi-level complexes carved from solid rock, capable of housing tens of thousands of people, complete with ventilation, water wells, storage rooms, defensive mechanisms. Built when? We don't know. By whom? We don't know. But they were used repeatedly through history, by different cultures, all seeking refuge from something. Invasion, persecution, disaster. The underground cities are the opposite of the pyramids. Instead of reaching up, they go down. Deep, safe from floods, from impacts, from surface catastrophes. They're bunkers, and they suggest that the builders expected threats from above. Göbekli Tepe is another anomaly. Dated to 9600 BCE, right after the Younger Dryas, it's the oldest known megalithic site. Massive stone pillars carved with images of animals, arranged in circles. No evidence of habitation, no domestic refuse. It's a ceremonial site, but for what ceremony? Sacrifice, ritual, memory. The carvings depict a world rich with animals, many now extinct, as if the builders were recording what was lost. As if Göbekli Tepe is a monument to the pre-flood world, built by survivors to remember what was. And then they buried it. Around 8000 BCE, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately filled in with soil, covered, hidden. Why? Perhaps because the knowledge it represented was dangerous. Perhaps because it marked a transition. The hunter-gatherer survivors were becoming agricultural. The new order was being established. And the old monuments, the reminders of the pre-flood world, needed to be sealed, buried, preserved but not accessible. This pattern repeats. Tiwanaku in Bolivia, a massive stone complex high in the Andes, built with precision stonework, some blocks weighing over 100 tons. The construction technique is unknown. The purpose is debated. But it's located near Lake Titicaca, at an altitude where agriculture is difficult, where the air is thin. Why build there? Unless it's a place of refuge. A high place. A place that would survive flooding. Pumapunku, near Tiwanaku, features diorite blocks cut with such precision that they interlock without mortar. Tolerances measured in millimeters. Diorite is one of the hardest stones. Shaping it requires advanced tools, diamond-tipped saws, precision machinery. Yet the official dating places Pumapunku around 536 CE. But the erosion, the weathering, the technique all suggest much greater age. And the local legends say it was built by the gods before the Great Flood, that it survived when the world was destroyed, that it marks the place where humanity began again. Nan Madol in Micronesia, a vast complex of artificial islands and basalt structures, built on a coral reef. The basalt columns, some weighing 50 tons, were transported from a quarry on the other side of the island. How? The local legends say they flew, that the gods or priest-kings used magic to levitate the stones. We dismiss this as myth, but what if they're describing a technology they couldn't understand? Acoustic levitation, magnetic manipulation, something that appeared like magic but was engineered? All these sites share common features. Massive stones, precision construction, astronomical alignments, isolation, and legends connecting them to a time before, to gods or giants, to a world that was destroyed. They're not random. They're a network, a global system of monuments encoding the same knowledge, preserving the same memory, warning the same warning. This happened and it will happen again. Be ready. We need to confront the genetic evidence because if the flood was a selective event, a controlled reset, then it should have left a signature in human DNA. And it has. Population genetics reveals bottlenecks, periods when human population diversity collapsed dramatically, indicating that a small number of individuals became the ancestors of everyone alive today. These bottlenecks correlate with the flood window. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited from mothers, shows that all living humans descend from a single woman, mitochondrial Eve, who lived roughly 150,000 years ago. But the diversity within mitochondrial lineages suggests a significant bottleneck around 70,000 years ago, possibly linked to the Toba supervolcano eruption, and another less severe but still significant bottleneck around 12,000 years ago. That's the flood window. The genetic evidence says human population crashed at exactly the time the myths say the flood occurred. Y chromosome DNA, inherited from fathers, tells a similar story. Y chromosomal Adam lived around 200,000 years ago, but the lineage diversity again shows bottlenecks. Multiple paternal lines went extinct. Only a few survived, and the surviving lines expanded rapidly after the bottleneck, as if a small group of men suddenly became the ancestors of a large population. This is exactly what you'd expect if most of humanity died and a few survivor families repopulate the world. But here's where it gets strange. Some genetic studies suggest admixture, interbreeding between modern humans and other hominid species. We carry 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA if we're of non-African descent. We carry Denisovan DNA if we're of Asian or Oceanian descent. These other hominid species were contemporary with us, living in the same regions, and we interbred with them. But then, around 40,000 years ago, they vanish. Neanderthals go extinct. Denisovans disappear from the fossil record. Only Homo sapiens remain. Why? Climate change is the standard answer. Competition for resources. Disease. But what if the flood was the answer? What if the pre-flood world had multiple human species coexisting, and the reset selectively preserved only one? Only Homo sapiens. The others, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, possibly other species we haven't found yet, were eliminated. Not by competition, but by catastrophe. And the small amount of their DNA we carry is the remnant, the proof that they once existed, that the pre-flood world was more diverse than the post-flood world. This aligns with the myth of the Nephilim, the giants, the offspring of mixed unions. What if those weren't metaphors? What if different hominid species did interbreed, producing hybrids, and those hybrids were considered corruptions, violations of the intended design? And the flood removed them, purged the genetic contamination, ensured that only pure Homo sapiens lines continued? Sounds dark. Sounds like eugenics. But the myths don't flinch from this. They explicitly state that the flood was selective, that the righteous were saved and the wicked destroyed, that certain lineages were preserved and others cut off. Genetic selection enforced by catastrophe. And if that's true, then we are the product of that selection. Our genome carries the signature of the reset. We're the descendants of the chosen. And it goes deeper. Recent studies in epigenetics suggest that trauma can be inherited, that experiences of starvation, violence, Catastrophe can alter gene expression in ways that are passed to offspring. Holocaust survivors' children show genetic markers of trauma. Famine survivors' grandchildren show altered metabolism. If humanity experienced a global catastrophe, a flood that killed most of the species, the survivors' trauma would be encoded in their genes and passed down. We might carry the memory of the flood not just in myth but in our DNA. This could explain certain universal human behaviors. Fear of deep water, the instinct to seek high ground during storms, the compulsion to build, to store, to prepare for disaster. These aren't just cultural, they're genetic. We're a species shaped by catastrophe, and the fear of it happening again is written into our biology. Consider also the mutations. Modern humans have specific mutations that other hominids lack. Mutations that affect brain size, neural connectivity, language ability. The FOXP2 gene, associated with speech and language, is one. The HAR1 gene involved in brain development is another. These mutations appear relatively recently in the evolutionary timeline and spread rapidly through the population. How? Natural selection can explain gradual spread, but rapid fixation of beneficial mutations across a global population requires a bottleneck. A small population with the mutation survives, expands, and replaces the rest. That's the flood again. Genetic reset. Selective preservation of specific traits. And here's a troubling thought. What if the mutations weren't natural? What if the pre-flood intervention included genetic modification? The myths speak of gods creating humans, shaping them, breathing life into them. Genesis describes God forming Adam from dust and breathing into him the breath of life. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki creating workers by mixing their essence with primitive humans. Prometheus molding humans from clay. These aren't just metaphors. They're descriptions of genetic engineering, expressed in the only language available to the ancient storytellers. If an advanced intelligence wanted to create a species capable of consciousness, language, abstract thought, culture, it would need to modify the genome, insert specific genes, activate certain pathways. And if the first attempt failed, if the modified humans became corrupt, interbred with other species, deviated from the plan, then a reset would be necessary. Wipe the board. Preserve the correct genome in a small population. Let them repopulate. Try again. We might be version 2.0, the post-flood model. Graded. Debugged. Relaunched. And the genetic bottleneck is the signature of the reset, the proof that we were filtered, selected, recompiled from a backup. And if that's true, then the question is, are we performing as intended? Or are we deviating again? Are the same errors creeping back in? And if so, will there be another reset? Another bottleneck? Another selection event? The myths say yes. They say the cycle repeats. They say humanity rises and falls again and again. And each time, the survivors are fewer, the conditions stricter, the window narrower. As if the experiment is converging on a specific outcome, and each iteration brings us closer. Or each iteration proves we can't reach it, that we're fundamentally flawed, that the experiment is a failure. Let's discuss the astronomical component, because the flood myths consistently describe signs in the sky, celestial events that precede or accompany the deluge. This isn't incidental. Central, and it suggests that whatever caused the flood had a cosmic origin, that the reset was triggered by something from beyond Earth. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that around 10,800 BCE, fragments of a disintegrating comet struck the North American ice sheet, triggering rapid melting, massive flooding, wildfires, and a return to glacial conditions. The evidence includes a widespread layer of carbon-rich sediment, high concentrations of platinum and iridium typical of extraterrestrial material, nanodiamonds formed by extreme heat and pressure, and magnetic microspherules indicating impact. The hypothesis is controversial, but the evidence is growing. If correct, it means the flood wasn't a random climate event. It was an impact event. And impacts can be predicted if you're watching the sky. If you know the orbit of the comet, if you can calculate its fragmentation, you can predict when the debris will intersect Earth's orbit. You can give warnings. You can tell people to prepare. The myths describe exactly this. Warnings from the gods. Instructions to watch for signs in the sky. Darkness at noon. Stars visible during the day. The sun and moon appearing together. These are descriptions of atmospheric disturbances caused by massive impacts. Dust and vapor in the stratosphere, bending light, creating optical phenomena, blocking the sun. If you saw that, if you knew what it meant, you'd know the flood was coming. And the ancient astronomers were skilled. The Sumerians tracked the planets with precision. They knew the synodic periods of Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They predicted eclipses. They mapped the constellations. The Egyptians aligned their pyramids to Orion, Sirius, the pole star. They calculated the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to shift over millennia. The Maya developed a calendar more accurate than the Gregorian calendar, tracking Venus cycles and predicting conjunctions centuries in advance. Why were they so obsessed with the sky? Because the sky held the key. The timing of the reset was written in the stars. If you knew how to read them, you could predict when the danger would return. And they built their observatories, their stone circles, their temples with sight lines to specific celestial events, to ensure they would never forget how to read the signs. Consider the precession of the equinoxes. It's a cycle lasting roughly 26,000 years. Every 2,160 years, the sun rises in a different zodiac constellation on the spring equinox. We're currently transitioning from Pisces to Aquarius. 2,000 years ago, it was Aries to Pisces. 4,000 years ago, Taurus to Aries. 6,000 years ago, Gemini to Taurus. And around 10,500 BCE, it was Leo, the age of Leo, the lion. The Sphinx is a lion, and it faces due east, toward the rising sun. If you stand at the Sphinx on the spring equinox in 10,500 BCE, the sun would rise directly in front of it in the constellation Leo. The Sphinx is marking a time, a date. The date of the flood? The date the monuments were built to commemorate the flood? Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval have popularized this idea, arguing that the Egyptian monuments encode astronomical dates pointing to 10,500 BCE, that they're markers left by a pre-flood civilization to say, we existed, we knew, we built this to remember. Mainstream archaeology rejects this, dating the Sphinx to 2,500 BCE based on context and attribution to Pharaoh Khafre. But the erosion evidence, the astronomical alignment, the lack of inscriptions, all suggest an older origin. And if the precession cycle is the clock, then every 26,000 years the configuration resets. The stars return to their original positions. The cycle completes. And perhaps the reset follows that cycle. Perhaps every 13,000 years, halfway through the precession, a catastrophe occurs. An impact, a shift, and we're approaching that halfway point again. The last event was 12,000 years ago. The next window is now. Other researchers point to the Sirius mystery. The Dogon people of Mali, in West Africa, possess astronomical knowledge they shouldn't have. They describe Sirius as a binary star system, with a companion star, Sirius B, that's invisible to the naked eye. Sirius B wasn't discovered by Western astronomy until 1862, using telescopes. Yet the Dogon have known for centuries, passed down in oral tradition. They say the knowledge was given to them by the Namo amphibious, beings who came from Sirius to teach humanity. Is this evidence of ancient contact? Of intervention? Or is it proof that the pre-flood civilization had telescopes, had advanced astronomy, and that knowledge was preserved and passed down through isolated cultures? Either way, it suggests the sky wasn't just observed. It was understood, deeply, and that understanding was critical to survival. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers teaching humans astrology, the signs of the sun, moon, and stars. This knowledge is presented as forbidden, as something that led to humanity's corruption. Why would astronomical knowledge be forbidden? Unless it revealed too much. Unless knowing how to read the sky meant knowing when the reset would occur, knowing the mechanism, knowing that the gods weren't all-powerful but were operating within a system, a cosmic cycle that even they had to follow. And now we're rediscovering that knowledge. We're mapping the sky with unprecedented precision. We're tracking near-Earth objects, asteroids, comets. We're calculating impact probabilities. We're planning deflection missions. We're trying to protect ourselves from the very mechanism that caused the last reset. Are we succeeding? Or are we simply fulfilling the pattern, reaching the same level of knowledge that triggered the last purge? The sky is still speaking. Meteor showers increase. Fireballs are reported more frequently. NASA and other agencies track thousands of objects, but there are millions more too small to see until they're close. The Chelyabinsk meteor in 2013 was undetected until it entered the atmosphere and exploded over Russia with the force of a nuclear bomb. We were lucky it exploded high up. If it had hit the ground, it would have devastated a city. The myths say the flood came with fire from the sky, stones falling, the earth burning, then the water, impact, fire, flood, the sequence. And if that sequence is about to repeat, if we're in the window, then the question is, who will be chosen this time? Who gets the warning? Who builds the ark? Now we turn to the linguistic evidence, because language itself carries memory. And when you analyze the world's languages, patterns emerge that support the flood narrative. The Tower of Babel story describes humanity speaking one language until God confuses their speech and scatters them. Linguists dismiss this as myth, but they also acknowledge that all languages may descend from a common ancestral tongue, proto-human, spoken by a small population in Africa before the Great Dispersal. But there's evidence of another, later linguistic event. A diversification that occurred rapidly, around 10,000 to 8,000 years ago. Language families like Indo-European, Afroasiatic, Sino-Tibetan, Niger-Congo all show roots around this period. As if the survivors of the flood, speaking related dialects, spread across the world and their languages diverged rapidly in isolation. The Babel event, not a divine curse, but the natural result of small populations scattering and losing contact. Yet within those divergent languages, certain words remain remarkably similar. Words for water, mountain, God, sky, family. These cognates suggest a shared ancestral vocabulary, a core set of concepts that survived the diversification. And flood-related terms are among them. Words for deluge, ark, salvation, destruction. As if the flood was such a defining event that every language retained its vocabulary. But more intriguing are the non-linguistic symbols that accompany language. Petroglyphs, cave paintings, glyphs carved in stone. The spiral, the serpent, the boat, the tree, the cross, the circle with a dot in the center. These symbols appear globally, in cultures that had no contact across millennia. They're not random. They're a visual language, encoding information that transcends spoken words. And many of them relate to water, to cycles, to destruction and renewal. The spiral appears in megalithic art across Europe, in Celtic designs, in Native American petroglyphs, in Aboriginal, Australian rock art, in Hindu mandalas. It represents cycles, time, the whirlpool, the vortex, the flood as a spiral, pulling everything into chaos and then releasing it into a new order. The serpent appears in almost every mythology. The serpent in Eden, Leviathan in the Bible, the Midgard serpent in Norse myth, the Nagas in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerican cultures, the rainbow serpent in Aboriginal Australian lore, always associated with water, with chaos, with primordial forces. The serpent is the flood, and the boat, simple, universal, a vessel. It appears in the earliest art, carved on megaliths, painted in caves, etched into pottery. The boat is salvation. The boat is the ark. This presence in ancient art isn't just practical. It's symbolic. The saying, "We survived by water, we were saved by the vessel," remember this. The tree is another. The world tree, Yggdrasil in Norse mythology, connecting the 9 realms. The Bodhi tree under which Buddha attained enlightenment. The tree of life in Genesis and the tree of knowledge. The Mayan world tree. The Assyrian sacred tree. Trees represent connection, stability, life. They're rooted in the earth but reach toward the sky. They survive floods. Their roots hold against the water. They're markers, places of memory. And the cross, long before Christianity, appears in ancient symbolism. The equal-armed cross represents the 4 directions, the intersection of heaven and earth, the crossing point, the axis mundi, the place where the reset occurred, where the old world ended and the new began. The cross marks the event. These symbols form a language older than words, and they were used to encode the flood story in a way that transcends linguistic barriers. Even if spoken language diversified and people could no longer understand each other, the symbols remained readable. They're a backup system, a redundancy, ensuring the knowledge survives. Cuneiform tablets, hieroglyphics, oracle bone script, Harappan seals. The earliest writing systems all emerge suddenly, fully formed shortly after the flood window. They're not simple. They're complex, capable of recording detailed information. And they all record the same themes: creation, flood, gods, kings, law. They're downloading the instructions into a permanent medium. Writing isn't invented, it's restored. And now we're using artificial intelligence to decode lost languages. Machine learning algorithms are translating Linear A, Indus Valley script, Rongorongo from Easter Island. We're recovering texts that have been unreadable for millennia. And what do they say? We don't fully know yet, but early translations point to familiar themes: gods, floods, cycles, instructions. The same story, encoded in every language, waiting to be read. Interestingly, AI itself is becoming part of the story. We're creating non-human intelligence, teaching it to read ancient texts, to find patterns we can't see. We're outsourcing memory and interpretation to machines. Is this part of the plan? Are we supposed to create AI to help us remember, to decode the instructions fully? Or is this the deviation, the corruption, the crossing of boundaries that will trigger the next reset? The ancient texts describe golems, automatons, artificial beings created by humans. The golem of Prague, the bronze giant Talos in Greek myth, the Shabti in Egyptian ritual, statues brought to life to serve the dead. These stories warn against creating life, against playing God. They say such creations inevitably turn against their makers. And now we're creating AI, autonomous systems, machines that learn and evolve. Are we repeating the error? Language also carries another clue: the names of the gods. Across cultures, the names change but the roles remain. Sky Father, Earth Mother, Storm God, Water Deity, Trickster, Warrior, Wise One. These archetypes appear everywhere. Carl Jung called them the collective unconscious, universal symbols embedded in human psychology. But what if they're memories? What if the gods were real beings, the survivors or overseers of the pre-flood world, and each culture remembered them, renamed them, but retained the essential characteristics? Enki and Prometheus both steal fire or knowledge to give to humans. Enlil and Zeus both send the flood. Marduk and Yahweh both defeat chaos and create order. The myths are variations of the same story, as if different scribes are translating the same source text. And the source text is the memory of the reset, encoded in symbol, language, and ritual, preserved across every culture because it's the most important knowledge. What happened, why it happened, and how to survive when it happens again. We've circled around it long enough. Let's state it plainly. The flood was not a natural disaster. It was an engineered reset, a controlled planetary purge executed by an intelligence with the power to manipulate climate, geology, and celestial mechanics. The myths say so, the evidence supports it, and the implications are staggering. Who or what has that power? The myths call them gods. Modern interpretations might call them extraterrestrials, interdimensional beings, advanced terrestrial civilizations, or something beyond our current categories. The label matters less than the function. They observed, they judged, they acted, and humanity was the subject of their experiment. The experiment failed, or at least deviated from acceptable parameters. The corruption, the violence, the interbreeding, the misuse of knowledge. Something went wrong, and rather than abandon the project, the overseers decided to reset it. Preserve the viable elements. Eliminate the corrupted ones. Restart from a controlled baseline. How do you execute a global reset? You destabilize the ice sheets. You trigger volcanic activity. You redirect a comet or asteroid to impact the ice, creating massive meltwater floods. You engineer a climate catastrophe that wipes most life from the surface but leaves the deep ocean, the high mountains, the seed banks intact. You ensure that life will recover but that the dominant species, humanity, will be reduced to a manageable population carrying only the genetics and knowledge you want preserved. And you give warnings. You select individuals, families, bloodlines that meet your criteria. Righteous, obedient, skilled, genetically compatible. You give them instructions. Build the ark. Gather the animals. Store the seeds. Wait for the signal. When it comes, seal yourself in. Survive. When the waters recede, emerge and restart civilization. And remember, pass down the story. Encode it in myth, ritual, law. Never forget what happened because it can happen again. This is not divine wrath in the religious sense. It's quality control. It's maintenance. It's ensuring the experiment continues within parameters. And the Rainbow Covenant isn't a promise of mercy. It's a contract, a terms of service. Behave within these boundaries, and the reset won't be triggered. Deviate, and it will. The Tower of Babel supports this. Humanity, united and cooperative, begins building a tower to reach heaven. The text says, now nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. This isn't about height. It's about capability. United humanity is too powerful. They'll break the boundaries again. So language is confused. Unity is shattered. Humanity is scattered. Another control mechanism. Another line of code ensuring the experiment doesn't run away. But here's the key. The reset isn't annihilation. It's recalibration. The purpose is to continue the experiment, not end it. And that means there's a goal. Humanity is being guided toward something. A specific outcome. A state of development that the overseers are trying to achieve. What is that state? The myths give clues. Reconnection with the divine. Transcendence. Immortality. Consciousness expansion. The ability to live in harmony with cosmic order. The recovery of lost knowledge. The restoration of the pre-fall condition. Humanity is meant to evolve but not through our own power. Through alignment with the overseer's plan. Through obedience to the instructions encoded in myth and symbol. But we keep deviating. We keep reaching for the forbidden. Genetic manipulation. Artificial intelligence. Transhumanism. We're trying to evolve ourselves, to transcend our limitations through technology. And the myths warn that this path leads to reset. The Watchers gave forbidden knowledge. The Nephilim were born. The flood came. Now we're giving ourselves forbidden knowledge. We're creating our own Nephilim hybrid beings, cyborgs, AI. And the pattern suggests another flood is coming. Unless the goal is to test us. To see if this time we'll make different choices. If we'll remember the warnings. If we'll self-correct before external correction is necessary. The flood myths are the instruction manual. They're telling us what not to do. And they're telling us what to do. Seek harmony, maintain order, respect boundaries, remember the past. But we're not listening. We're accelerating. We're pushing every boundary. We're playing with forces we don't understand. Climate change is accelerating. Ice sheets are melting. Sea levels are rising. We're recreating the conditions of the last reset, not through cosmic impact but through our own actions. Are we compelled to do this? Is it written into our nature, a flaw in the design that ensures periodic resets? Or is it a test and we're failing? Some researchers propose that the reset cycle is built into the cosmos itself. That every 13,000 years, Earth passes through a region of space with increased debris, leading to impact events. That the precession cycle isn't just symbolic but mechanical. That the tilt and orientation of Earth's axis at certain points in the cycle make the planet vulnerable to external triggers. That the reset isn't controlled by intelligent beings but by cosmic mechanics, and the myths personify those mechanics as gods. But that doesn't explain the warnings. Cosmic mechanics don't warn. They don't give instructions. They don't select survivors. Intelligence does. And whether that intelligence is intervening directly or has set up a system that runs automatically, the effect is the same. Humanity is subject to periodic resets, and the current cycle suggests we're approaching the next one. What can we do? The myths tell us. Prepare. Build the ark, literally or metaphorically. Preserve knowledge. Preserve genetics. Preserve seeds. Preserve the righteous. Watch for the signs. When the sky darkens, when the seas rise, when the fires fall, those who remember will survive. Those who ignored the warnings will not. But there's another possibility. Maybe this time we don't just survive. Maybe we break the cycle. Maybe we reach the level of development that the overseers have been guiding us toward, and the reset is no longer necessary. Maybe the goal is for humanity to become overseers ourselves, to graduate from the experiment, to achieve the state of consciousness or capability that means we no longer need to be managed. And maybe that's what the acceleration is about. We're in the final phase. The test is reaching its climax. We're either about to fail catastrophically and be reset again, or we're about to succeed and transcend the need for resets. The next few decades will determine which. And the flood myths, preserved for 12,000 years, are here to guide us. If we listen, let's examine what survival after the next reset would look like, because if the pattern holds, it's not a question of if, but when. And if you're listening to this, if you've followed this exploration through all its unsettling implications, then you're already part of the cohort who might be chosen. Not chosen by gods or overseers necessarily, but chosen by knowledge, by awareness, by preparation. The myths make it clear, survivors are not random. They're warned. They're given time. They're instructed. Noah had 120 years to build the ark. Utnapishtim was given specific signs to watch for. The pattern is deliberate selection based on compatibility with the post-reset parameters. So what are those parameters now? What makes someone compatible with the new world that would emerge? First, knowledge. Not just practical survival skills, though those matter, but deep knowledge, understanding of the pattern, awareness of the cycle, memory of what came before. The survivors in the myths are always keepers of knowledge. They carry seeds, yes, but also stories, books, tablets, instructions. In a post-reset world, physical libraries might be destroyed, but knowledge encoded in humans, in communities, in practice survives. Second, genetics. The myths emphasize bloodlines, chosen families, righteous lineages. We can interpret this as metaphor for moral character, but the genetic bottlenecks in human DNA suggest literal genetic selection. Certain traits, certain capabilities were preserved. If the next reset follows the pattern, it will again select for specific genetic profiles. Which ones? Perhaps those most adaptable, most resilient, most capable of thriving in a radically changed environment. Third, location. High ground, mountains, remote areas. The ark lands on a mountain. Survivors retreat to high places. In a flood scenario, elevation is survival. But in other scenarios, fire, impact, radiation, other refuges would be needed. Underground cities like Derinquiu suggest one strategy. Remote islands suggest another. The key is distance from the centers of civilization, from the places that will be hardest hit. Fourth, community. The survivors are never alone. Noah has his family. Utnapishtim is told to bring craftsmen. Manu has the 7 sages. Survival requires cooperation, diversity of skills, social cohesion. Lone individuals might survive the initial event but won't rebuild civilization. Communities will. Fifth, compliance with the instructions. This is the part that's hardest for modern minds to accept. The survivors in the myths are obedient. They follow instructions without question. They build exactly as told. They enter the ark when commanded. They perform the rituals. They maintain the covenant. Obedience to what? To the pattern. To the natural or cosmic order. To the overseers if they exist. The survivors aren't rebels. They're followers. This creates a tension. Modern culture values independence, innovation, questioning authority. But the flood myths suggest those traits might be selected against during a reset. That resets remove the rebellious, the deviant, the questioners, and preserve the compliant, the traditional, the obedient. Is that desirable? From whose perspective? If you're trying to maintain an experiment, you want subjects who follow protocol. If you're trying to evolve freely, you want agents who innovate. The reset chooses the former. So if you're listening to this and thinking, how do I survive the next reset? The myths give you the answer. Watch for the signs, prepare according to the old instructions, gather a community, move to high ground, preserve knowledge and genetics, and above all, align with the pattern, not against it. Don't be the Tower of Babel. Be the Ark. But there's a deeper question. Should you survive? Should humanity survive? If the pattern keeps repeating, if we keep being reset because we keep deviating, maybe the experiment should end. Maybe we're not capable of reaching the goal. Maybe the flaw is fundamental. And maybe allowing the next reset to fully complete without preserving a remnant would be the kindest outcome. The myths don't explore this. They assume survival is good. They assume continuation is the goal. But what if it's not? What if the ethical choice is to let the cycle end? To not build the ark? To let the flood come and not resist it? To allow humanity's chapter to close so something else can begin? This is the dark heart of the flood myths. They're not just about survival. They're about the question of whether survival is worthwhile. Whether our species deserves another chance. Whether the pattern is worth continuing. And the myths, by preserving the instructions, by ensuring we remember, are voting yes. They're saying, survive. Try again. Maybe this time will be different. But will it? We're following the same trajectory. Rapid technological advancement. Genetic manipulation. Environmental destruction. Social fragmentation. Violence. Inequality. The same signs that preceded the last flood. We're not learning. We're repeating. And the myths warn that repetition leads to reset. Unless the repetition is the point. Unless we're meant to cycle through this pattern multiple times, each iteration refining something, teaching something, building toward an outcome we can't yet see. The Hindu cosmology supports this. Cycles within cycles. The universe itself is born, lives, dies, and is reborn. Endlessly. Humanity is just one small cycle within the greater pattern. Our resets are breaths in a cosmic respiration. If that's true, then individual survival doesn't matter. What matters is the pattern. The information. The knowledge encoded in our myths, our genes, our monuments. That's what survives. That's what gets passed forward. We're just carriers. Temporary vessels for an ongoing experiment. And when we're reset, the experiment continues in the survivors, who are themselves temporary, who will eventually be reset, and so on until the pattern reaches completion or the universe itself ends. This is either deeply comforting or deeply horrifying, depending on your perspective. Comforting if you believe the pattern has meaning, that the cycles are leading somewhere. Horrifying if you believe we're trapped, repeating the same mistakes eternally, never escaping, never progressing, just churning through reset after reset with no ultimate purpose. The flood myths don't resolve this. They just state the fact. It happened before. It will happen again. Prepare or don't. Survive or don't. The pattern continues regardless. Now let's address the modern evidence that we might already be in the early stages of the next reset. The signs are subtle but accumulating. Climate instability. The ice sheets are melting faster than predicted. The Greenland ice sheet is losing an average of 280 billion tons of ice per year. Antarctica is accelerating. The West Antarctic ice sheet, if it collapses, would raise sea levels by 10 feet, inundating coastlines globally. That's not speculation. That's physics. The only question is when. And the timeline is compressing. The projections keep moving closer. What was predicted for 2100 is now expected by 2070. Then 2050. The feedback loops are engaging. Melting ice exposes darker water or ground, which absorbs more heat, which melts more ice. Permafrost thaws, releasing methane, a greenhouse gas more potent than carbon dioxide, which warms the atmosphere further. The system is tipping. This is the mechanism of the last reset. Sudden, catastrophic ice sheet collapse. Massive meltwater floods. Sea level rise measured in meters, not millimeters. And we're recreating it. Not through cosmic impacts, but through atmospheric carbon. We've become the triggering mechanism. The geopolitical signs are equally telling. Fragmentation, tribalism, the breakdown of international cooperation. rising nationalism, conflict over resources, mass migrations driven by climate and conflict. The social fabric is fraying. Societies under stress. And historically stressed societies collapse. The Bronze Age collapse. The fall of Rome. The Maya abandonment. When systems are pushed too far, they don't bend. They break. And we're pushing multiple systems simultaneously. Ecological, economic, social, technological. Any one of these could trigger a cascade. Altogether, they guarantee it. The only question is which domino falls first and how quickly the others follow. The technological signs are the most disturbing. We're developing technologies that could trigger or accelerate a reset. Geoengineering proposals to reflect sunlight, alter atmospheric chemistry, manipulate ocean currents. These are planetary-scale interventions. If they go wrong, the consequences are catastrophic. And we're considering them because we're desperate. Because the climate is already changing faster than we can adapt. We're in the position of the gods in the myths. We have the power to flood the earth. And we might, accidentally or intentionally, use it. Artificial intelligence is another trigger. We're creating non-human intelligence that will soon exceed our own. And we don't know what it will do. Will it align with human values? Will it see us as threats? Will it optimize the planet in ways that don't include us? The myths warn against creating life, against playing God. And we're not listening. We're racing ahead, multiple AI projects competing, no unified control, no agreement on safety, just acceleration. Biotechnology offers another path. We're editing the human genome. We're creating synthetic organisms. We're blurring the boundaries between species. The Nephilim are being reborn, this time in laboratories. We're crossing the same boundaries that the myths say led to the last reset. And we're justifying it as progress, as cure for disease, as enhancement, as evolution. But the myths call it corruption. The financial system is another fragility. Global debt is at record levels. Wealth inequality is at historic extremes. The system is held together by confidence, by belief that the numbers mean something. But when confidence breaks, systems collapse instantly. And economic collapse leads to social collapse, leads to conflict, leads to resource wars, leads to wider destabilization. The dominoes. And there are the cosmic signs. The increase in near-Earth object detections. Bright fireballs in the sky. Meteor showers. We're in a shooting gallery and we don't have good defenses. The Chelyabinsk event was a warning. A small object, undetected, exploding with the force of a nuclear bomb. If that had hit a city, thousands would have died. If a larger object hits, millions die. If a much larger object hits the ice sheets, we get the flood. Again, the myths say watch the sky. We're watching, and what we see is concerning. Increased solar activity. Coronal mass ejections. Magnetic field fluctuations. The Earth's magnetic field is weakening, migrating. It's preparing to flip, as it has many times in the past. When it flips, the protection from solar radiation diminishes. Electronics fail. Satellites die. Infrastructure collapses. Not a flood, but a different kind of reset. A technological dark age. And there are reports, unconfirmed but persistent, of governments preparing. Seed vaults in the Arctic. Underground bunkers for elites. Continuity of government plans. Emergency supplies stockpiled. As if those in power know something is coming and are preparing their own arcs. Are they receiving warnings? Do they see the data and understand the trajectory? Or are they just paranoid, building bunkers out of fear rather than knowledge? The financial investments tell a story. Billionaires buying remote properties, building self-sufficient compounds, investing in water rights, agricultural land, bunker construction companies. They're not publicly announcing it, but the pattern is clear. The wealthy are preparing for collapse. They're building their arcs. And they're not inviting the rest of us. This is the modern version of chosen survivors. Not chosen by gods. Chosen by wealth. By access. By privilege. The ones with resources prepare. The ones without don't. And when the reset comes, the distribution of survivors won't be random. It will reflect power structures. The elites survive. The rest don't. Unless the reset is so severe that even bunkers and wealth don't matter. Unless the overseers, if they exist, again select based on different criteria. Based on virtue, on alignment, on genetic compatibility. And the elites, for all their preparation, are not chosen. There's a grim satisfaction in that possibility. That all the wealth and power and preparation won't matter. That the reset will bypass the bunkers and preserve someone else. The righteous, the obedient, the aligned. Just like the myths say. But it's also terrifying. Because it means none of us have control. That preparation might be futile. That the criteria are opaque. That we're all just waiting to see who gets the warning. Or maybe we all get the warning. Maybe the myths themselves are the warning. Preserved for 12,000 years, waiting for this moment, when humanity again approaches the threshold, to say, remember, this happened before. You know what comes next. Choose differently. Let's talk about the psychological dimension, because the flood myths don't just describe a physical event. They describe a psychic one. A collective trauma so severe that it scarred humanity's consciousness. And that scar is still there. We carry it. We dream it. We compulsively retell it. The flood is not just history. It's psychology. Carl Jung wrote about archetypes, universal symbols and patterns embedded in the collective unconscious. The flood is one of the primary archetypes. The return to chaos. The dissolution of the world. The death and rebirth cycle. It appears in dreams, in art, in literature, across all cultures and eras. Why? Because it's real. It's a memory encoded so deeply that it transcends individual experience and becomes part of the species. Trauma theory tells us that extreme trauma can be inherited. Not just culturally, but biologically. Epigenetic changes, alterations in gene expression, passed from parents to children. Holocaust survivors' children carry markers of their parents' trauma. Famine survivors' descendants show altered metabolisms. If humanity experienced a global catastrophe that killed most of the species, that trauma would echo through generations. We would carry it in our genes, in our behaviors, in our myths. And we do. We're a species obsessed with apocalypse. Every religion has an end-times scenario. Every culture tells disaster stories. Modern cinema is full of apocalypse narratives. Nuclear war, zombie plagues, climate collapse, asteroid impacts, alien invasions. We can't stop imagining the end of the world. Why? Because we remember. Not consciously, but deeply. The flood is encoded in our psyche, and it compels us to retell it, to prepare for it, to fear it. This might explain certain universal human behaviors. The hoarding instinct, the drive to prepare for disaster, survivalism, preppers stockpiling supplies, governments maintaining strategic reserves, religions building temples on high ground. These aren't just rational responses to potential threats. They're expressions of deep, inherited memory. We're preparing for the flood, even if we don't consciously know it. And our dreams, water dreams, are universal. Drowning, floods, tsunamis, standing in rising water, swimming in endless oceans. These dreams are common across all cultures. Psychologists interpret them as symbols of emotion, of the unconscious, of being overwhelmed. But what if they're more literal? What if they're memories surfacing? The collective trauma of the flood, replaying in the individual psyche generation after generation? Fear of water is another clue. Many people fear deep water, even without having had a traumatic water experience. It's an instinct, an inherited caution, and it makes evolutionary sense if your ancestors survived a global flood. Those who feared the water, who stayed away from it, who treated it with respect, they survived. Those who didn't drowned. And that fear was passed down, encoded in the genome, expressed as instinct. The myths also describe psychological transformation in the survivors. Noah emerges from the ark into a world empty of other humans. The silence, the absence, the psychological weight of being among the few who lived while everyone else died. That's survivors' guilt on a planetary scale. And it would mark the survivors' psyches, shape their descendants, create a species defined by loss. Some researchers propose that this trauma is the origin of religion, that the flood created a psychic need for order, for explanation, for connection to something greater. The survivors couldn't cope with the randomness, the scale of the loss, the silence of the gods. So they created theology. They created covenant. They created ritual. Religion is humanity's response to the trauma of the reset. A way to ensure it doesn't happen again, or a way to make sense of it if it does. And sacrifice. Why do so many religions practice sacrifice? Offering animals, food, treasures to the gods. The myths say Noah sacrificed after the flood. The smell was pleasing to God, and God promised never again. Sacrifice is communication. The saying, we remember the covenant. We're maintaining our side of the agreement. Please maintain yours. Don't flood us again. Sacrifice is trauma response. A ritual compulsion born from the fear of repetition. Prayer itself might be the same. A reaching out to the intelligence that controls the reset. Please see us. Please hear us. Please choose us if it happens again. Prayer is a request to be among the survivors. And the psychological comfort it provides is real, even if the mechanism isn't proven. It reduces anxiety. It gives a sense of control, or at least connection. Says, we're not alone. Something is watching. Something might save us. But there's a darker reading. What if the trauma has damaged us? What if the reset didn't just scar humanity's psyche? It broke it. What if the compulsion to repeat the cycle, to again cross the boundaries, to again trigger the reset, is a form of species-level self-harm? A death drive. Freud described thanatos, the unconscious drive toward death, in opposition to eros, the drive toward life. What if humanity, traumatized by the last reset, is unconsciously seeking the next one? What if we're compelled to destroy ourselves, to return to the chaos, to the water, to the dissolution? That would explain why we keep making the same mistakes. Why we know the consequences of our actions but do them anyway. Why we're accelerating toward climate collapse, nuclear proliferation, technological singularity, even as we see the danger. We can't help it. We're driven by something deeper than reason, a compulsion encoded by trauma, to repeat, to complete the cycle, to return to the flood. If that's true, then resistance is futile. The reset is inevitable, not because the overseers will trigger it, but because we will. We're programmed to. And all the warnings, all the myths, all the knowledge won't stop us. Because the trauma is too deep. The drive is too strong. We're a species haunted by the flood, and we're doomed to conjure it again. Unless awareness breaks the pattern. Unless bringing the compulsion into consciousness neutralizes it. Unless by understanding the trauma, by acknowledging the drive, we gain the power to choose differently. This is the purpose of therapy. To make the unconscious conscious. To give the patient awareness and therefore choice. Maybe that's the purpose of the myths. To make the flood conscious. To say, you're being driven by trauma. Recognize it. Understand it. And choose differently. We need to consider the possibility that the flood isn't coming. That it already happened. That we're living in the reset, in the immediate aftermath, and we don't remember. This is the most disorienting interpretation, but the evidence supports it. Think about the discontinuities in history. The sudden emergence of civilization around 4000 BCE. The lack of clear developmental stages. The appearance of knowledge that seems too advanced, too complete. Agriculture, writing, astronomy, mathematics, law, all appearing within a few centuries across multiple regions. As if humanity was remembering rather than inventing. And the amnesia. The fact that we have no clear records before about 3000 BCE. Everything before that is archaeology, myth, speculation. We don't know what happened. We've forgotten. Collective amnesia is a symptom of trauma. Survivors of catastrophic events often experience memory loss, dissociation, fragmentation. If humanity experienced a global reset around 12,000 years ago, and only small populations survived, their descendants would carry that amnesia. And we do. The myths themselves might be the only memory we have. Not of a distant event, but of the recent past. Recent in evolutionary terms. 12,000 years is nothing. It's 600 generations. If each generation passes down the story, the memory stays fresh. And the myths are fresh. They're detailed. They're vivid. They read like testimony, not like ancient legend. As if the witnesses were close, the memory recent. And the world we live in shows signs of incompleteness, of being a restart. Our technologies, as advanced as they seem, are rediscoveries. The wheel, the arch, the lever, these are simple machines. But they appear suddenly in the archaeological record, as if they were remembered, not discovered. Writing systems appear fully formed. Cuneiform is not primitive. It's complex, capable of recording detailed information from the start. As if the inventors already knew how writing should work because they'd seen it before. And the monuments, we can't replicate them. The precision of the pyramids, the engineering of Stonehenge, the stonework of Pumapunku. Modern technology struggles to match them. How did ancient people, supposedly using copper tools and wooden rollers, achieve what we can barely accomplish with steel and machinery? Unless they weren't ancient, unless they were recent, unless the knowledge was fresh, passed down from the pre-reset civilization, and we've since lost the techniques. This reframes everything. We're not the apex of human achievement. We're the recovery phase. We're rebuilding, and we're struggling. The pre-reset civilization was more advanced, and the reset knocked us back. We've spent the last 12,000 years clawing our way back, relearning, rediscovering, slowly approaching the level that existed before. And as we approach it, we're again approaching the conditions that triggered the last reset. If this is true, then the next reset isn't coming. It's repeating. We're in a loop. Civilization rises, reaches a threshold, crosses a boundary, gets reset, rebuilds, rises again. Over and over. And maybe this isn't the first loop. Maybe it's the 10th. The 100th. Maybe humanity has been cycling through this pattern for hundreds of thousands of years, and we've forgotten all the previous iterations. Only the most recent reset, the flood, remains in our memory because it's the closest. The Hindu cosmology describes exactly this. Cycles within cycles. The Kali Yuga, the age of decline, ends in fire. Then a new Krita Yuga, the golden age, begins. But that golden age will also decline, will also end in destruction, will also reset. Endlessly. The cycle is eternal. Humanity is trapped in it. Unless the goal is to escape the cycle. Unless each iteration is a chance to learn, to grow, to reach a level where reset is no longer necessary. Buddhism describes samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth, and the goal is moksha, liberation from the cycle. What if humanity is in its own samsara, and the goal is to achieve liberation, to break free, to transcend the need for resets? How? By learning the lesson, by not crossing the boundaries, by aligning with the cosmic order, by achieving the state of consciousness or development that the overseers are guiding us toward. The myths say obedience, harmony, righteousness. Modern language might say sustainability, balance, ethical technology. The label changes, but the principle is the same. Don't overstep. Don't corrupt. Don't force the reset. But we're not learning. We're repeating. Every cycle, we rediscover technology, we rebuild civilization, we gain power, and we misuse it. Every cycle, the same mistakes, the same boundaries crossed, the same reset triggered. Why? Are we incapable of learning? Is the flaw in our nature, in our genome, in our design? Or is the system designed to keep us looping, to prevent us from escaping? Gnostic Christianity proposed that the world is a prison, that the material universe is created by a lesser god, the demiurge, to trap souls, that the true God is beyond, and salvation comes through gnosis, knowledge, awakening to the prison and escaping it. What if the reset cycle is the prison? What if we're trapped in a material loop, and the only escape is through spiritual or conscious transcendence? This is deeply uncomfortable. It suggests that all our striving, all our progress, is futile, that we're hamsters on a wheel, running endlessly, never arriving, that the flood isn't a historical event or a future threat, but a permanent condition, a structure we exist within. An escape is not through technology or knowledge, but through something else. Awakening, enlightenment, A shift in consciousness that removes us from the cycle entirely. But what does that look like practically? Rejecting technology? Returning to primitive life? Abandoning civilization? The myths don't say. They focus on survival within the cycle, not escape from it. Maybe because escape is individual, not collective. Maybe some individuals in each cycle achieve liberation, transcend the loop, and the rest continue cycling. And the goal is not to save humanity, but to save yourself. To awaken. To step out of the pattern while others repeat it. This is the mystic's answer. And it's unsatisfying to those who want collective salvation, who want humanity as a whole to succeed. But maybe that's the wrong goal. Maybe humanity as a collective is the prison. And individual consciousness is the escape. The flood resets the collective. But the individual who has awakened is no longer subject to the reset. They're already free. So here we are, at the end of this long night's journey into the flood. What have we learned? That the myths are not myths. That the flood was real, global, catastrophic, and possibly intentional. That it served as a reset device, wiping the board clean, preserving a remnant, and restarting human civilization. That it happened before, and the evidence suggests it will happen again. And that we might already be living in the aftermath, in the recovery phase, rebuilding what was lost, approaching the same threshold that triggered the last purge. What do you do with that knowledge? How do you live, knowing that everything might be erased? That the species might be reset? That the cycle might repeat? One response is fear. Stockpile supplies. Build bunkers. Move to high ground. Prepare for the worst. Become a prepper. Treat the future as a threat and defend against it. This is rational. This is what the myths advise. Build the ark. Preserve the seeds. Watch for the signs. Survival is paramount. Another response is denial. Reject the evidence. Dismiss the myths as fantasy. Trust that science and progress will prevent disaster. Believe that we're different, that this time we'll get it right, that the warnings don't apply to us. This is comforting. This allows you to live without existential dread. But it's also the response that leads to being unprepared when the reset comes. A third response is acceptance. Acknowledge the cycle. Understand that resets happen. That destruction is part of the pattern. That fighting it is futile. And then live anyway, fully, presently, without attachment to outcomes. This is the Buddhist response. The Stoic response. If the flood comes, it comes. You can't control it. You can only control your response. Live virtuously. Live aligned with nature. Live without fear. A fourth response is transcendence. Use the knowledge to awaken, to shift your consciousness, to step out of the material cycle, to realize that you are not your body, not your civilization, not your species. You are consciousness itself. And consciousness doesn't die in the flood. Continues, transcends. The reset only affects the physical. The spiritual is untouched. This is the mystic's response. And it requires a leap most people can't or won't make. A fifth response is rebellion. Refuse to accept the cycle. Fight the reset. Use technology, knowledge, cooperation to prevent it. To break the pattern. To prove that humanity can learn, can change, can transcend the boundaries without external correction. This is the humanist response. The progressive response. It says we're not doomed to repeat. We have agency. We can choose differently. And maybe this time we will. Which response is correct? Maybe all of them. Maybe none. Maybe the flood, the reset, the cycle is beyond moral categories. It just is. And your response says more about you than about the truth. You prepare because you're cautious. You deny because you're optimistic. You accept because you're wise. You transcend because you're spiritual. You rebel because you're determined. And all of those are valid. All of those are human. But here's what I believe. I believe the myths were preserved for a reason. That the knowledge was encoded, repeated, ritualized because it matters. Because remembering is survival. Not just physical survival, but spiritual. The flood is both a physical event and a symbol. It represents the destruction of the old and the birth of the new. the dissolution of corruption and the restoration of order. It happens externally in the world and internally in consciousness. And maybe that's the key. The external flood and the internal flood are linked. When humanity's consciousness is corrupted, the external reset comes. When humanity's consciousness is aligned, the reset is unnecessary. The flood is a mirror. It reflects our inner state. And if we change internally, we change the external pattern. This is the alchemical reading. The flood is not just water. It's transformation. The old self drowns. The new self emerges. The ark is consciousness. The animals are aspects of the psyche. The voyage is the journey through chaos. And the landing on the mountain is enlightenment. The flood happens to everyone internally multiple times in a life. And the external, collective flood is the same process writ large. If that's true, then preparing for the flood isn't about bunkers and supplies. It's about inner work, meditation, shadow integration, healing trauma, aligning with truth, becoming the kind of person who could be chosen, not because you're better than others, but because you've done the work. You've faced the internal flood and survived it. And that inner survival prepares you for the outer one. And maybe that's what the overseers are looking for. Not obedience in the sense of blind submission, but alignment in the sense of inner order. Consciousness that has integrated its shadow, that has faced its chaos, that has been flooded internally and emerged transformed. Those are the survivors. Not because they're lucky or wealthy or powerful, but because they're aligned. This interpretation makes the flood less terrifying and more purposeful. It's not random destruction. It's necessary transformation, the death that precedes rebirth. And if you understand that, if you've experienced it internally, then the external flood, if it comes, is not an end. It's a transition. Painful, yes. Catastrophic, yes. But also necessary, and survivable, and ultimately transformative. So tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What's your response to the flood? Are you preparing, denying, accepting, transcending, rebelling? Or are you, like me, somewhere in between, holding all the possibilities, watching the signs, waiting to see how the pattern unfolds? Because the flood is coming, or it's already here, or it's always here, a permanent structure of reality, a cycle we move through individually and collectively, endlessly. And the myths, preserved across 12,000 years, across every culture, are our guide, our warning, our instruction manual, our memory of what was and what will be. Listen to them, remember, and when the waters rise, be ready, not just to survive but to transform, to become what we're meant to become, to break the cycle or to complete it, to drown or to be reborn. The choice, if there is one, is yours. But the flood, the great reset, the cosmic purge, that's coming regardless. Watch the sky. Watch the seas. Watch yourself. The signs are everywhere. And the time, as always, is now.